Lavish Doris Duke did not inherit money. She inherited a silence so expensive it had to be maintained every day of her life. Gaslight never touched her world, but the logic was the same. Soften the edges, sweeten the air, keep discomfort out of sight. Born into the final glow of America's Gilded Age, Doris Duke entered a fortune already sealed, managed, and medically precise. Trustees spoke in calm voices. Lawyers handled her future like a fragile instrument. Wealth flowed quietly, deliberately, never raising its voice, because it never needed to. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in. If stories like this hold you, quiet power, hidden costs, lives polished smooth by money, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from tonight. These histories are best absorbed slowly, when nothing else is demanding your attention. Because this is not a tale of extravagance meant to impress. It is a study in containment, a life embalmed in luxury where freedom came. Itemized, intimacy was supervised, and loneliness wore diamonds so convincing no one thought to look closer. Doris Duke became the last heiress of a dying era, not because she wanted to be remembered, but because the Gilded Age refused to let her disappear. The fortune arrived before consciousness did. It waited in ledgers, vaults, and boardrooms long before Doris Duke understood the meaning of possession or loss. By the time she learned to read, the machinery of inheritance was already in motion, humming softly, never pausing, never asking permission. Wealth, in her case, was not acquired, it was administered. She was born into a world where money had ceased to behave like money. It no longer announced itself with extravagance or spectacle. It functioned instead like a controlled substance, odorless, powerful, dosed carefully by men who spoke in reassuring tones and signed documents thicker than childhood memory. This was not the fevered wealth of speculation or risk. It was legacy money, consolidated, institutional, designed to endure quietly while everything else aged. The Gilded Age had not ended so much as retreated indoors. Its excesses were no longer public, they were upholstered. Where robber barons once declared themselves through architecture and industry, their descendants learned discretion. Doris Duke entered this softened afterlife of power, an America where fortunes wore restraint like etiquette and influence preferred not to be noticed at all. Her father's empire had already hardened into permanence. Tobacco money moved differently than newer wealth. It inhaled the nation slowly, dependably, leaving behind profit and habit in equal measure. By the time Doris existed, the fortune was no longer tied to effort or innovation. It simply persisted. And when her father died, abruptly and publicly, the system absorbed the shock without flinching. Grief in her world was handled professionally. Lawyers arrived before memory had time to settle. Trustees assembled not as villains but as caretakers, men trained to protect value, to prevent erosion, to maintain continuity. They spoke of duty and stewardship. They spoke of her best interests. And in doing so, they quietly converted a child into an asset requiring oversight. Doris Duke did not inherit freedom. She inherited safeguards. Every dollar was placed behind glass. Every decision acquired a witness. Childhood was not stolen from her. It was reorganized. Emotional exposure was minimized. Risk was reduced. Privacy became conditional. The world, in its concern, wrapped her in layers thick enough to prevent harm and thick enough to prevent error. There was no cruelty in this. That was the most dangerous part. Nothing about her early life felt overtly oppressive. The rooms were elegant, the routines orderly, the adults calm. Yet the atmosphere carried a faint sweetness, like ether in a hospital ward, comforting, numbing, and impossible to escape once inhaled. She learned early that nothing truly belonged to her, not even herself. Ownership was theoretical, access was temporary, control resided elsewhere. Even her future existed in draft form, reviewed by committees that had known her longer as a beneficiary than as a person. The world beyond her estate gates continued to modernize. Empires fell, fortunes scattered. But Doris Duke remained fixed at the center of a system designed to preserve an idea that some wealth must never be allowed to behave like ordinary money, and some lives must never be allowed to unfold unsupervised. She did not ask for this role. She was shaped for it. And as the Gilded Age faded from public memory, its final inheritance settled quietly into her hands, not as power, but as obligation. Before Doris Duke was a daughter, she was a consequence. Her father belonged to a generation that believed industry was destiny and consolidation was virtue. He did not invent tobacco, nor did he romanticize it. He refined it, organized it, and rendered it inevitable. Cigarettes moved through the country with the same quiet certainty as railroads and electricity, threading habit into daily life until dependence felt natural. The fortune that resulted was not flamboyant, it was structural. James Buchanan Duke understood power best when it did not announce itself. He learned early that the most enduring empires were those that embedded themselves into routine, into mornings, breaks, pauses, nerves. Tobacco was not sold as pleasure so much as relief. The business model relied not on desire, but on repetition. That philosophy would shape everything that followed, including the household his daughter entered. By the time Doris was born, her father no longer needed to prove anything. His work was complete in the way monuments are complete, fixed, unquestioned, and largely invisible to those who live beneath their shadow. The Duke fortune had matured past personality. It did not require its creator to remain alive. This made him distant, though not cruel. He was a man shaped by systems and schedules, accustomed to seeing outcomes rather than processes. Affection, like risk, was expressed sparingly. His role was not to nurture, but to ensure continuity. And continuity, to him, meant insulation from uncertainty at all costs. The household reflected this philosophy. Order preceded emotion, predictability replaced intimacy. Nothing was left to chance, not meals, not visitors, not the future of the child who would inherit everything he had constructed. Doris Duke grew up inside a machine that had been calibrated long before she arrived. When illness took him, it did so efficiently. His death was sudden, but not disruptive. Markets did not panic. Boards did not fracture. The system he had built absorbed the loss with professional calm. What remained was not a grieving family, but a sequence of procedures already prepared. Death, like everything else, had been anticipated. For Doris, the loss was immediate and incomprehensible. But around her, the adults moved with remarkable composure. Mourning occurred quietly, in appropriate intervals, without indulgence. Grief was permitted, but only in forms that did not interfere with function. This was the moment when inheritance ceased to be abstract. The fortune passed not into her hands, but into a structure designed to act on her behalf. Trustees emerged as the true inheritors of her father's worldview. They preserved his priorities with reverence, stability, discretion, preservation. The Duke name became less a family identity than a corporate condition. Her father, even in absence, remained present, not as memory, but as policy. The tobacco empire continued to operate as it always had, supplying comfort to millions while quietly binding them to habit. The irony was unspoken. No one remarked on the parallel between the product that sustained the fortune and the atmosphere surrounding its air, soothing, addictive, and slowly narrowing. Doris Duke did not rebel against her father's legacy. She had no language for rebellion yet. Instead, she adapted. She learned early that survival in her world depended on stillness. Questions were unnecessary. Compliance was interpreted as maturity. The man who had shaped her fate receded into history, praised for his vision and discipline. What remained was his most lasting creation, not the empire, but the conditions under which his daughter would live, an inheritance designed to endure even if the person inside it could not breathe freely. By the time Doris Duke could form memories, they were already being archived. Her days unfolded beneath an invisible lattice of documents, trusts, clauses, safeguards, contingencies, each one drafted with the solemn confidence of men who believed paper could prevent harm. Childhood in this environment was not spontaneous. It was supervised. Every allowance carried a condition, every movement traced back to a signature. The future existed not as imagination, but as a legal object waiting to be delivered at the appropriate age. There were schedules for everything. Education was planned years in advance, calibrated to produce refinement without risk. Tutors arrived quietly and left the same way. Lessons emphasized control. language spoken without accent, posture without tension, curiosity without excess. She learned to absorb information rather than pursue it. Questions were welcomed only if they arrived already softened. Affection, like money, was mediated. Caretakers rotated, gently, chosen for reliability rather than attachment. No one lingered long enough to become indispensable. Emotional bonds were permitted but provisional, dissolving politely when contracts ended. In this way, loss was introduced early, but without ceremony, not as trauma, but as routine. The estate itself reinforced the lesson. Rooms were large enough to create distance, furnished to suggest comfort while discouraging disorder. Silence was not enforced. It simply settled naturally into the corners. Sound softened against drapery and carpet. Even laughter seemed careful, as if it had learned not to echo. Doris moved through these spaces with the unease of someone being observed by something she could not see. She was never alone, yet rarely accompanied. Presence was constant, intimacy rare. Her guardian spoke of protection, of patience, of waiting until she was ready, though no one could say precisely what readiness meant. The law did not feel threatening. That was its triumph. It arrived with reassurances, with phrases like best interest and prudent management. It presented itself as benevolence, and because it never raised its voice, it was rarely questioned. Doris Duke absorbed this atmosphere as naturally as breath, learning early that safety and surveillance often shared the same face. There were moments of ordinary childhood, play arranged politely, toys selected for durability rather than joy. Gifts arrived wrapped and cataloged. Nothing was impulsive. Even pleasure was reviewed. She learned restraint before she learned rebellion. When she reached for something unscripted, a friendship that lingered too long, an interest that wandered off schedule, it was not forbidden outright. Instead, it was redirected, diluted, delayed. Time itself became a method of control. Anything could be postponed until it lost urgency. Adults around her praised her composure. They remarked on her maturity. They admired how little trouble she caused. No. One questioned whether stillness might be a learned response to constant observation. Her name appeared repeatedly on documents she did not understand, each mention reinforcing a truth she felt but could not articulate, that her identity existed as much on paper as it did in flesh. She belonged simultaneously to herself and to an institution dedicated to her preservation. And preservation, she would learn, is not the same as living. As the years passed, childhood did not end so much as dissolve into preparation. Every stage was framed as temporary, leading toward a future already decided. Freedom was described as something she would earn later once she proved she could handle it. The ink dried. The clauses remained. And Doris Duke continued to grow inside a life written for her, not cruelly, not dramatically, but with such meticulous care that deviation itself began to feel dangerous. The houses did not feel lived in. They felt prepared. Every residence associated with Doris Duke was built to perform a single quiet task, to reassure. Walls were thick, ceilings high, corridors long enough to slow footsteps before they reached their destination. Nothing startled, nothing intruded. Even corners seemed softened, as though sharpness itself had been edited out of the architecture. These were not homes in the ordinary sense. They were environments engineered to calm anxiety before it could surface. Light entered carefully, filtered through heavy curtains that turned daylight into something polite and manageable. Sound died quickly, absorbed by carpets, upholstery, and distance. Rooms did not invite spontaneity. They encouraged composure. One did not rush in these spaces. One drifted, paused, adjusted. Doris Duke learned the language of these rooms before she learned how to articulate discomfort. She sensed what they required of her, a certain stillness, a measured pace, an understanding that emotion should never move faster than decorum allowed. The houses did not punish misbehavior. They simply made it feel out of place. Visitors commented on the elegance. They remarked on the taste, the restraint, the quiet luxury that distinguished old money from new. What they did not see was how these spaces trained behavior, how architecture could shape silence into habit. A room designed to reassure does not ask questions. It answers them in advance. When Doris entered a parlor or dining room, The space absorbed her presence without acknowledging it. Nothing shifted. Nothing responded. She was safe here, the rooms promised, protected from disorder, from surprise, from the outside world with its noise and unpredictability. But safety has a temperature. Over time, she felt the coolness beneath the comfort, the sense that these spaces were not meant to hold her, only to contain her. They were designed to protect the idea of continuity, of the Duke name, the Duke fortune, the Duke calm, not the emotional life of the person moving through them. The furniture did not invite rearrangement. Objects stayed where they were placed, as though any alteration might disturb something unseen. Even flowers seemed carefully chosen to avoid strong scent or unruly growth. Nature, like emotion, was permitted only in controlled doses. There were bedrooms large enough to feel impersonal, studies where nothing personal was ever studied, sitting rooms that encouraged sitting but not lingering. Everything had its place, and Doris increasingly understood that she did too. She became adept at mirroring her surroundings. When the rooms were quiet, she was quiet. When the rooms were formal, she was formal. Her presence learned to disappear into the architecture, leaving behind an impression of composure that adults found reassuring. They praised how well she adapted. What they did not consider was the cost of adaptation when it becomes permanent. In these houses, distress did not erupt. It diffused. Loneliness did not announce itself. It echoed faintly and then faded. If something felt wrong, the environment suggested that the feeling would pass if given enough time and quiet. This was the most enduring lesson the rooms taught her. The discomfort was temporary, but silence was permanent. As Doris Duke moved from one estate to another, the pattern repeated. Different locations, same atmosphere. Geography changed, but the emotional climate remained constant. Each home reaffirmed the same principle, that a well-designed space could replace human closeness, that beauty could substitute for warmth. She learned to trust rooms more than people, and as the years passed, the reassurance they offered began to resemble sedation, gentle, effective, and increasingly difficult to resist. Wealth, in Doris Duke's world, did not announce itself. It did not glitter loudly or demand admiration. It did not arrive with spectacle or threat. It existed instead as a constant, low presence, a hum beneath daily life, so steady it became indistinguishable from silence itself. This was money that had learned manners. Checks were written quietly. Accounts shifted without discussion. Needs were met before they were articulated. There were no negotiations, no urgency, no visible transaction between desire and fulfillment. The fortune operated like an internal organ, vital, invisible, and unquestioned. From an early age, Doris understood that money was not something one spoke about. It was something one assumed. To ask about it would have been to misunderstand its role. This was not currency meant for exchange. It was a condition of existence. Adults around her spoke of responsibility rather than privilege. They emphasized prudence, stewardship, restraint. Wealth, they explained, was safest when it behaved modestly, when it blended in, when it became background. And so it did. There were no arguments about cost. Nothing was weighed against affordability. Instead, choices were framed as appropriate or inappropriate, tasteful or unnecessary. Value was aesthetic, not numerical. Expense did not matter so long as it did not call attention to itself. This created a peculiar detachment. Doris Duke learned early that money was not a tool she wielded, but a presence she moved around. It did not empower her, it preceded her. Decisions were softened by it, delayed by it, rerouted through it. When problems arose, money did not solve them directly. It absorbed them quietly until they lost definition. This was wealth as anesthetic. When discomfort appeared, grief, loneliness, confusion, money did not confront it. Instead, it padded it. New environments appeared, new routines, new distractions. The sensation dulled without ever being addressed. Relief came, without understanding. Over time, this taught her something dangerous, that pain could be managed without being acknowledged. The fortune's silence was deliberate. Loud money attracts scrutiny, quiet money survives. And survival, above all else, was the lesson her world prioritized. The Duke fortune had endured wars, scandals, social upheaval, and economic collapse precisely because it refused to dramatize itself. Doris absorbed this ethic instinctively. She learned not to ask too much of money, and money asked nothing of her in return, except compliance. There were moments when she sensed the imbalance, when she noticed that others spoke of money as aspiration or threat, while for her it functioned more like weather. It shaped behavior without being challenged. It dictated possibilities while denying the language to describe them. She did not feel rich. She felt insulated. And insulation, she would discover, carries its own risks. It dulls sensation. It delays awareness. It creates distance between cause and effect. The louder consequences of wealth, envy, resentment, dependence, never reached her directly. They were filtered out by staff, by intermediaries, by the careful choreography of her life. This made her seem untouched, untouchable. Yet beneath that calm surface, something essential was missing. Money that never raised its voice also never listened. It did not respond to longing. It did not explain itself. It simply continued. As Doris Duke grew older, she would begin to recognize this silence not as comfort, but as absence. The absence of friction, of consequence, of genuine engagement. The fortune protected her from hardship, yes, but it also protected her from clarity. And so she lived within its quiet power, wrapped in a wealth so polite it never once asked who she might have been without it. Grief entered Doris Duke's life the way everything else did, scheduled, supervised, and contained. There was no chaos when her father died, no uncontrolled outpouring, no public unraveling. The machinery surrounding her adjusted with practiced ease, as though death itself were merely another contingency long accounted for. Black fabric appeared, correspondence changed tone, voices lowered slightly. Then the system continued. In her world, grief was not an event, it was a condition to be handled. Adults spoke softly around her, not out of uncertainty, but out of policy. There were prescribed intervals for mourning, discreet acknowledgments of loss, and an unspoken expectation that composure would return on schedule. Sadness was permitted, briefly, quietly, and only insofar as it did not disrupt continuity. No one asked Doris what she felt. They assumed it. They assumed shock. They assumed confusion. They assumed resilience. Each assumption replaced the need for listening. Consolation arrived prepackaged in the form of routine and reassurance. She was told she would be cared for. That everything had been arranged, that nothing essential would change. And in this, they were correct. The house did not change. The staff did not change. The rhythm of days remained intact. Meals arrived on time. Lessons resumed. Visitors came and went with solemn expressions that never lingered too long. Even sorrow behaved politely, keeping its distance. This was grief rendered inert. For a child, loss often announces itself through absence. An empty chair, a silenced voice, a disruption of habit. But Doris Duke experienced no such rupture. Her father vanished, yet the structure he left behind remained so intact that it absorbed the loss entirely. His presence lingered not in memory, but in policy. His authority survived him, preserved in clauses and instructions that governed her life more thoroughly than any living parent could. This created a peculiar confusion. She knew something had been taken from her, yet nothing around her reflected that truth. The world insisted on normalcy. It insisted on calm. It insisted that she was safe. Safety, however, is not comfort. In the absence of visible grief, Doris learned to internalize her own. There was no language provided for it, no space made for its unpredictability. Emotion that could not be expressed outwardly learned to turn inward, becoming quieter, heavier, more diffuse. She sensed that her sadness was inconvenient, not forbidden, merely unnecessary. The system did not require it. It had already adjusted. It did not need her pain to function, and so it gently discouraged its expression. There were distractions instead, new tutors, new environments, new assurances that time would smooth everything out. Time, in this context, became a solvent. Adults trusted it implicitly. They believed that given enough quiet, grief would evaporate on its own. What they did not consider was what might remain once it did, a residue of unacknowledged loss lingering beneath the surface, shaping behavior without ever being named. Doris Duke became adept at this kind of quiet endurance. She learned to perform acceptance, to appear composed, to mirror the calm expected of her. In doing so, she received praise for her strength, her maturity, her remarkable ability to cope. Coping became her most valued skill. Yet beneath that skill lay a subtle disorientation. Without visible markers of mourning, she struggled to locate her own feelings. Grief existed, but it floated, unattached to ritual or release. It had no beginning and no end. It simply persisted, softened by luxury and buried beneath obligation. This was the inheritance no one discussed, not the fortune, but the emotional vacancy left by loss that was never allowed to fully arrive. Grief, managed professionally, does not disappear. It simply learns how to behave. At some point, without announcement or ceremony, Doris Duke ceased to be a child and became a responsibility. This transformation did not occur through neglect or malice. It unfolded through care, meticulous, documented care, administered by people who believed deeply in their own benevolence. She was no longer regarded solely as a person to be protected, but as a value to be preserved. And preservation, as the men around her understood it, required distance. Her name circulated in rooms she never entered. It appeared in reports, projections, forecasts. Her future was discussed in the same language used for markets and endowments: stability, longevity, risk exposure. Childhood in this framework became a vulnerability, something to be managed carefully until it passed. No one said asset aloud. There was no need. The logic was implicit. Every aspect of her life acquired a secondary meaning. Education was no longer about curiosity, it was about suitability. Companionship was evaluated for influence. Habits were monitored for optics. Even temperament was noted, recorded, assessed for long-term implications. Calm was praised. Passion raised quiet concern. She sensed this attention without fully understanding it. Adults listened closely to what she said, but more closely to how she said it. A careless remark could be smoothed over. A visible emotion could be reframed as fatigue. Everything could be corrected, provided it was caught early enough. This constant calibration trained her to self-monitor, to anticipate reactions before expressing thought, to ask herself not what she felt, but how it would be received. The world around her became a mirror that reflected only acceptable versions of herself. There were moments when she tested the boundaries, small deviations, subtle resistances, an attachment that lingered, an interest that persisted beyond polite encouragement. Each time, the response was measured and calm. No reprimand, no confrontation, only redirection. The path ahead was gently adjusted until deviation became inconvenient. In this way, control remained invisible. The people entrusted with her care believed they were safeguarding her from harm, and in many ways they were. She would never experience financial insecurity. She would never be unprotected. She would never be exposed to sudden loss without cushioning. But what they also safeguarded was the continuity of the fortune itself. Her well-being and the well-being of the estate became indistinguishable. As she grew older, Doris began to understand that expectations hovered around her like an unspoken script. She was to be gracious, composed, unremarkable in the ways that mattered. Scandal was the true enemy. Impropriety, the unpardonable sin. To exist quietly was to succeed. This created a strange inversion of value. Her individuality became secondary to her function. The role she occupied mattered more than who she might have been without it. Even rebellion, if it came, would be interpreted through the lens of impact rather than intention. She did not resent this outright. Resentment requires clarity, which she felt. Instead was a persistent sense of displacement, the feeling of standing slightly apart from her own life, watching decisions occur with her name attached, but her voice absent. When adults spoke of her future, they spoke with certainty. When they spoke to her, they spoke with reassurance. Both carried the same message. Everything was under control. And yet, control has a cost. To be treated as an asset is to be valued for endurance rather than expression. It is to be protected from damage at the expense of experience. Doris Duke learned early that she was precious, and that precious things are rarely allowed to move freely. She adapted, as she always had. She learned to remain intact, but intact is not the same as alive. Privacy was never denied to Doris Duke. It was rationed. From the outside, her life appeared secluded, even protected, gated estates, private rooms, carefully limited access. Yet true privacy, the kind that allows a person to exist, unobserved, was conspicuously absent. Someone always knew where she was meant to be. Someone always anticipated her needs before she voiced them. Solitude existed only within parameters. She learned early that being alone was different from being unwatched. Servants moved quietly, but they moved constantly. Advisors did not intrude, but they remained aware. Letters were received, sorted, filtered. Invitations arrived already evaluated. Even silence was curated, permitted only where it would not be misunderstood. Privacy, in this world, was treated like a volatile substance, useful in small doses, dangerous if allowed to accumulate. The rationale was always protection. The outside world was curious, hungry, unkind. Attention could corrode. Exposure invited distortion. These dangers were real, and the people surrounding Doris spoke of them with practiced sincerity. They believed vigilance was love, that surveillance was a necessary price for safety. And so her life unfolded beneath a watchful calm. There were no locked doors in the emotional sense, because nothing threatening was expected to occur inside them. The threat was always external. Outsiders might misinterpret, outsiders might exploit, outsiders might contaminate the carefully maintained image of stability. To prevent this, information moved selectively. Doris Duke became accustomed to partial truths. She learned that not everything said to her was complete, and not everything she said would be passed on. Conversations were shaped by discretion long before they reached her. The world arrived filtered, edited for tone and implication. This created a subtle disorientation. She sensed that reality existed beyond her immediate experience, but she could not access it directly. Knowledge came mediated. Events were summarized. Emotions were translated into acceptable language before being presented to her. In time, she learned to censor herself preemptively. Thoughts that felt too sharp were softened before being spoken. Questions that lingered too long were abandoned. Curiosity became internal, cautious, rarely expressed. Privacy, she realized, was not something one possessed. It was something one was granted temporarily, under supervision. Even her own inner life felt subject to review. She became adept at keeping secrets, not because she had been taught deception, but because openness felt unsafe. Too much disclosure invited intervention. Too much candor risked correction. Silence, on the other hand, passed unnoticed. The paradox was cruel. The more she complied, the less visible she became. And the less visible she became, the more her guardians praised her discretion. Privacy as a controlled substance does not intoxicate. It numbs. It dulls the impulse to confide, to protest, to assert. It trains the mind to operate inwardly, to rely on reflection rather than expression. Doris Duke developed a rich internal landscape precisely because she had no other place to put her thoughts. Yet, even there, she felt the limits. She knew that any private rebellion would ultimately collide with reality, with trustees, with expectations, with the inertia of a fortune that moved more slowly and more powerfully than any individual desire. The boundaries were invisible, but they were firm. And so she lived in a careful equilibrium, balancing exposure and concealment, learning exactly how much of herself could be revealed without consequence. Privacy, she learned, was not freedom. It was a privilege administered sparingly, one more instrument in a life designed to remain intact at all costs. The age was supposed to be over. Newspapers spoke of progress, of reform, of a nation sobered by excess and chastened by collapse. Trusts were broken, fortunes scrutinized, manners revised. America congratulated itself on having survived its gilded delirium and emerged more responsible, more modern, more restrained. Yet in certain rooms, nothing had changed. The Gilded Age did not vanish. It withdrew. It retreated from public display into private continuity, abandoning spectacle while preserving structure. Its wealth no longer demanded admiration, it preferred invisibility. It learned how to linger. Doris Duke lived inside that lingering. Her life was proof that an era could outlast its reputation. The habits of old money, discretion, insulation, endurance, remained fully intact behind estate walls and legal frameworks. While the country reimagined itself, the systems surrounding her continued as they always had, quietly confident that time would adjust to them rather than the other way around. The Gilded Age, as she experienced it, was no longer loud. It was antiseptic. Gone were the grand declarations of conquest and industrial bravado. In their place came committees, trusteeships, philanthropic boards. Power dressed itself in responsibility. Excess learned to justify itself through caution. Wealth ceased to be theatrical and became procedural. This made it harder to identify and harder to escape. Doris moved through a world that insisted it was no longer gilded, even as it reproduced every condition that had defined the era. Money still controlled space. Space still controlled behavior. Behavior still dictated worth. The difference was tone. Everything was quieter now, smoother, less willing to draw attention. She sensed this contradiction early. Outside her gates, America celebrated mobility, self-invention, the promise of choice. Inside, life remained fixed, inherited, pre-approved. The myth of opportunity existed everywhere except where she lived. Her presence itself felt anachronistic, a living remnant of a system that refused to fully dissolve. People spoke of her fortune as historical, as though it belonged to another century. Yet it continued to operate seamlessly in the present, untouched by the reforms meant to restrain it. This produced a subtle tension. Doris was both relic and resident. She belonged to a past that had not finished asserting itself. The lingering Gilded Age expressed itself not through opulence, but through inevitability. The assumption that some lives would always be buffered, some names always protected, some outcomes always negotiable. This was not arrogance, it was inertia. And inertia is difficult to confront. As the world modernized, her environment absorbed the change without surrendering authority. New language replaced old, but the power remained centralized. The fortune adapted, shedding any behavior that invited scrutiny while retaining its core advantage, insulation from consequence. This insulation shaped Doris in ways no one fully acknowledged. She grew up without the friction that forces most people to define themselves against resistance. There were no external pressures demanding clarity or urgency. Life arrived pre-softened, pre-negotiated. The cost of this became increasingly apparent. Without struggle, purpose diffused. Without risk, desire dulled. The world asked little of her, and in return offered little definition. The Gilded Age lingering around her did not inspire ambition. It encouraged preservation. She learned that survival was the highest virtue. The tragedy was not that she lived too lavishly, but that she lived inside an era already embalmed. The Gilded Age had not prepared her to move forward. It had prepared her to remain. And so, Doris Duke became something rare and unsettling. Not a symbol of excess, but of continuity. A woman born after the age was declared finished, yet raised entirely within its softened afterlife. An era lingering long enough to shape one last heir. Long before Doris Duke learned to read faces, she learned to feel them. Attention surrounded her not as curiosity, but as condition. It was present in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way voices adjusted their pitch, in the way questions were framed carefully so as not to invite the wrong answer. She was never interrogated. She was observed. This watching did not feel hostile. That was its genius. Those around her did not stare. They monitored. Their gaze was gentle, almost affectionate, disguised as concern. Tutors noted her progress. Caretakers recorded her moods. Advisors spoke of her temperament with clinical calm. Nothing was urgent, nothing was ignored. From the beginning, Doris understood that she existed within a field of awareness that did not belong to her. Every action carried a faint echo, a sense that it would be remembered somewhere else, by someone else, for reasons she could not yet articulate. Her laughter, her silences, her preferences, All became data points in an ongoing effort to predict and preserve her future. The result was subtle self-consciousness. She learned to measure herself before being measured, to anticipate interpretation before expression. When she felt an impulse, she paused, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The pause became reflexive, as natural as breath. This was how surveillance becomes internal. No one instructed her to behave. There were no lists of rules, no overt prohibitions. Instead, behavior shaped itself around expectation. The world responded most warmly when she was calm, agreeable, unremarkable. Praise followed composure. Attention sharpened when deviation appeared. She adjusted accordingly. Doris Duke did not experience childhood rebellion because rebellion requires privacy, space to test boundaries unseen. Her life offered no such margins. Even solitude felt provisional, granted rather than assumed. Someone always knew where she was supposed to be, even if they did not occupy the room with her. This created a strange intimacy with restraint. She learned to perform herself, not theatrically, but subtly, a version calibrated to avoid correction. Over time, performance hardened into habit. The watchers rarely spoke of what they saw. Their influence was quiet. Decisions were adjusted behind the scenes. Schedules shifted. Opportunities appeared or disappeared without explanation. She sensed consequence without ever witnessing cause. This taught her something crucial, that power need not announce itself to be absolute. The world watched her not because she was dangerous, but because she was valuable. And valuable things, she learned, are monitored closely, not to control them overtly, but to ensure they remain intact. This realization carried its own weight. She began to understand that her life was not solely her own narrative, it was a collective project, a future shaped by many hands, each one believing they acted in her best interest. The tragedy lay not in their intentions, but in their certainty, because certainty leaves no room for becoming. As she grew, the watching intensified, though it never changed tone. Adolescence brought new assessments, new anxieties quietly addressed. Friendships were evaluated, suitors noted, interests categorized. Every development was met with analysis rather than curiosity. She was observed, but rarely known. The distinction mattered more than anyone realized. To be watched is to be seen as surface. To be known requires risk, the possibility that what is discovered may complicate the plan. Doris Duke's world did not welcome complication. And so she continued under its gaze, learning to exist without friction, without eruption, without the freedom to surprise even herself. The watchers believed they were preserving her future. What they could not see was how much of her present was being slowly erased in the process. They never raised their voices. That was the first thing Doris Duke noticed about the men entrusted with her future. Their authority did not arrive with command or intimidation. It entered rooms quietly, carried in measured phrases and carefully chosen words. They spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed disagreement was unnecessary. These were the trustees, custodians of a fortune too large to be left to impulse, too old to be trusted to youth. They did not present themselves as rulers. They presented themselves as guardians. And in doing so, they made resistance feel impolite. Their meetings were orderly, their language precise. Decisions emerged fully formed, framed as inevitabilities rather than choices. This is how it must be done. This is what is best. This is how your father intended it. Each phrase closed a door without appearing to touch it. Doris learned early that their softness was not weakness. They listened attentively when she spoke, nodding with practiced sympathy. They acknowledged her concerns, validating them just enough to neutralize them. Nothing was dismissed outright. Everything was absorbed, adjusted, and returned to her in a form that aligned with existing plans. This created the illusion of participation. She was invited to understand, not to decide. Explanations replaced consent. When she hesitated, reassurance arrived immediately, accompanied by subtle reminders of responsibility, not only to herself, but to the name she carried, the employees who depended on the estate, the charitable obligations already in motion. The trustees never threatened her. They never needed to. Their power lay in framing. They framed obedience as maturity, compliance as wisdom, doubt as inexperience. And because Doris had been trained to value composure above all else, she learned to receive their guidance without protest. In their presence, emotions felt excessive. They did not forbid feeling, but they translated it into manageable terms. Anxiety became concern. Anger became misunderstanding. Desire became impatience. Everything could be softened, renamed, filed away. The trustees believed sincerely in their mission. They saw themselves as stabilizing forces in a volatile world. They had witnessed fortunes collapse under the weight of indulgence and mismanagement. They knew what happened when heirs acted without restraint. In their minds, they were preventing disaster. What they did not consider was the cumulative effect of being perpetually managed. Doris Duke's adulthood did not arrive with autonomy. It arrived with expanded consultation. Her legal status changed, but the structure remained intact. Authority did not transfer, it diffused. The trustees continued to occupy the space between her impulse and its execution, ensuring nothing moved too quickly, too freely. They spoke often of patience. Patience, they insisted, was the hallmark of wisdom. Time would clarify everything. There was no need to rush. Yet this patience always seemed to benefit the system more than the person inside it. The longer decisions were delayed, the more entrenched the existing order became. Doris felt this acutely. She sensed that her life was being extended sideways rather than forward, broadened with obligations and options that never quite resolved into choice. The trustees' voices followed her even when they were not present, internalized as caution. She began to question herself before questioning them. This was their greatest success. They did not control her actions so much as her expectations. They trained her to view freedom as something dangerous, a force that required moderation, supervision, and gradual release. And so she moved carefully, carrying the weight of their guidance as though it were her own judgment. The trustees remained calm, composed, always available to advise. They spoke softly, and in that softness, an entire life learned to stay within bounds it had never chosen. Nothing in Doris Duke's life occurred suddenly. Events did not erupt. They arrived. Invitations, opportunities, changes in direction, all appeared as though they had been waiting patiently somewhere just beyond her awareness, fully formed and ready to be accepted. By the time a choice reached her, it had already passed through hands she would never see. This was the architecture of pre-approval. Decisions did not present themselves as questions. They arrived as conclusions, accompanied by explanations carefully designed to feel persuasive rather than directive. The language was always courteous. "We've considered this carefully. This aligns with your interests. This seems the most sensible course." The effect was subtle but decisive. Dissent felt unnecessary, even childish. Doris learned early that spontaneity was inefficient. Impulse required correction, desire required evaluation, preference required context. The people guiding her life believed sincerely that freedom functioned best when filtered through experience, their experience. They had seen mistakes made by others, fortunes undone by haste. They knew what happened when wealth was allowed to behave recklessly. And so, they intervened before intervention became visible. Her education followed this pattern. Schools were chosen not for curiosity, but for suitability. Subjects emphasized balance, polish, restraint. There was always a rationale, always a reassuring narrative about preparation and stability. She was being shaped for something important, though no one ever defined what that something was. Relationships, too, arrived already interpreted. Friends were welcomed cautiously, their presence monitored for compatibility rather than affection. Suitors were assessed quietly, their intentions weighed against optics, lineage, temperament. Romance, when it appeared, was treated as a variable, interesting, potentially disruptive, requiring oversight. Doris began to understand that her feelings were not the final authority on her own life. They were inputs, not outcomes. This realization did not come with anger. It came with resignation. She had been raised to trust the system surrounding her, to believe that protection and control were indistinguishable. If her instincts diverged from the approved path, she assumed the divergence was her error, not the system's. Self-doubt flourished easily in such soil. The pre-approval of decisions created a smoothness that others admired. Her life appeared orderly, disciplined, free of scandal. Observers mistook this for contentment. They praised her composure, her prudence, her apparent ease with responsibility. What they did not see was how rarely she experienced choice in its raw form. Choice implies risk, the possibility of failure, regret, consequence. Doris's world was designed to minimize all three. Every outcome was cushioned, every misstep anticipated. This made life safe, but it also made it distant. She began to feel as though she were moving through a script she had not written, delivering lines that fit well enough but never quite belonged to her voice. Even moments of rebellion felt anticipated, as though the system had already prepared for them. The most unsettling realization was this: even resistance had limits. If she pushed too hard, concern replaced reassurance. Discussions lengthened. Consequences were described gently but clearly. She was reminded of obligations, to family, to legacy, to the many people whose livelihoods depended on stability. Responsibility became the quiet counterweight to desire, and so most impulses dissolved before becoming actions. Doris Duke did not feel imprisoned. That would have required walls she could see. Instead, she felt suspended, held in a permanent state of readiness, always preparing for a future that never fully arrived. Decisions pre-approved create lives pre-contained, and within that containment, she learned to move carefully, to want modestly, to accept conclusions that were never truly hers. Education arrived in Doris Duke's life not as discovery, but as refinement. From the beginning, learning was presented as a corrective measure, a way to polish instinct, to temper curiosity, to replace uncertainty with fluency. Knowledge in this context was not meant to open doors. It was meant to close them quietly, sealing off error before it could occur. Her schooling was impeccable. Languages were taught until they sounded effortless. History was delivered without conflict, art without disruption, literature without danger. The world appeared curated, stripped of rough edges and unresolved questions. Every subject reinforced the same principle, that clarity lay in restraint and mastery in moderation. There was no shortage of information. There was a shortage of permission. Doris learned how to perform intelligence rather than pursue it. She absorbed facts smoothly, reproduced interpretations correctly, and demonstrated understanding without ever testing its boundaries. Teachers praised her aptitude, her discipline, her ability to learn without agitation. She was, by every visible measure, an ideal student. What went unremarked was how little room remained for wonder. Education, as she experienced it, was not a path outward. It was a narrowing corridor leading toward acceptability. The purpose was not to help her find herself, but to ensure she never strayed too far from expectation. Knowledge became a form of social alignment. Questions were welcome, so long as they had answers already prepared. Curiosity that lingered too long was gently redirected. Topics that invited discomfort were reframed or omitted. There was no explicit censorship, only emphasis. Certain ideas received attention, others faded quietly into irrelevance. This shaped her internal world profoundly. Doris learned early that thinking too deeply about certain subjects led nowhere productive. That insight, when it challenged structure, was less useful than composure. She became adept at intellectual containment, developing a mind capable of understanding complexity while avoiding its implications. Her education taught her how to sound certain without being convinced. Institutions reinforced this lesson. She moved through schools that prized decorum over disruption, achievement over inquiry. Her presence carried weight, and the environment responded accordingly. Teachers treated her with respect, sometimes deference. Expectations adjusted, standards softened. This deprived her of friction, the essential resistance that sharpens thought. Without resistance, education becomes rehearsal. She learned how to navigate intellectual spaces without ever feeling at risk within them. Debate remained polite. Critique stayed abstract. There was no urgency, no necessity to defend or define herself. Ideas floated, untested, never forced into collision with consequence. As a result, learning became ornamental. It decorated her life without altering it. It provided language without direction, culture without agency. She became fluent in many things and anchored in very few. Escape, she realized, was not something education was designed to offer her. Education prepared her to inhabit her role more elegantly, not to abandon it. It reinforced the belief that the world was already arranged, that understanding it meant adapting to it rather than reshaping it. This realization did not arrive with disappointment. It arrived with quiet acceptance. Doris Duke emerged from her schooling accomplished, articulate, and fundamentally unchanged. The system had succeeded. It had given her knowledge without momentum, awareness without exit. Education without escape leaves one exquisitely informed and perfectly contained. And so she moved forward, better prepared to live the life chosen for her, yet no closer to discovering whether another life had ever been possible. Affection was never forbidden in Doris Duke's world. It was observed. From the moment companionship began to matter, it arrived accompanied, not by warning, but by presence. Attention sharpened whenever emotion appeared. Interest was noted. Attachments were tracked quietly, like weather patterns that might signal an approaching change. Love, she learned, was not dangerous. Unmanaged love was. There were always adults nearby, always intermediaries between feeling and consequence. Friends were introduced carefully, their backgrounds understood before their intentions were considered. Invitations were extended and accepted through channels that ensured nothing occurred accidentally. Even casual intimacy carried the faint sensation of review. This supervision was subtle. No one intruded openly. No one interfered unless necessary. Instead, the environment adjusted around her relationships, nudging them into safer forms. Meetings took place in appropriate settings. Time was structured. Privacy remained conditional. Doris began to understand that intimacy was permissible only within certain boundaries. Emotion itself was not discouraged. Intensity was. She could admire, appreciate, enjoy. But longing, dependence, or urgency created discomfort among those tasked with her care. Such feelings introduced unpredictability. They complicated schedules, they resisted planning. The response was always gentle. If a friendship grew too central, alternatives appeared. If an attachment deepened, conversation followed, not confrontation, but guidance. Advisors spoke of balance, perspective, the importance of maintaining independence. Concern disguised itself as wisdom. Doris internalized these lessons quickly. She learned to temper her feelings before anyone else needed to. She adjusted her own expectations, scaling back attachment until it fit the acceptable shape. Desire, she discovered, could be diluted without disappearing entirely. Romance, when it emerged, was treated as a test. Suitors were evaluated not for compatibility, but for risk. Their ambition, their temperament, their ability to handle scrutiny all mattered more than affection itself. Love became something to be measured against reputation, stability, and public consequence. This made it difficult to trust her own instincts. When she felt drawn to someone, she wondered what she was missing, what the system saw that she did not. Doubt crept in, not about others, but about herself. If an attachment required supervision, perhaps it was flawed by nature. She learned to keep emotional distance, not as defense, but as habit. Those who grew close to her sensed this restraint. Conversations remained polite, affection controlled, intimacy stalled just before vulnerability. Doris did not lack feeling. She lacked permission to surrender to it, and surrender, she was taught, carried consequences. Love, in her world, was something to be managed like wealth or reputation. It could not be allowed to act freely, to disrupt equilibrium. Even happiness was suspect if it arrived too suddenly or too intensely. This supervision did not eliminate loneliness, it refined it. Doris Duke became skilled at maintaining relationships that looked full while remaining carefully contained. Companionship existed, but it rarely deepened. Emotional closeness hovered just beyond reach, always postponed until circumstances aligned. Circumstances, of course, never fully did. The tragedy of love under supervision is not that love disappears. It survives, quieter, cautious, self-monitoring. It learns to exist without demand. And so Doris carried affection like a fragile object, always careful not to drop it, never quite daring to hold it tightly enough to feel its weight. Marriage, when it arrived in Doris Duke's life, was approached not as surrender, but as trial. It was spoken of carefully, framed in language that suggested opportunity rather than inevitability. Companionship, stability, normalcy, these were the words used, each one weighted with implication. Marriage was presented as something that might resolve what had long remained unsettled, an arrangement that could provide structure without threatening control. It was not romance that guided the conversation, it was hypothesis. Those around her treated marriage as a variable worth testing. Would it ground her? Would it simplify public perception? Would it reduce scrutiny? The union itself mattered less than its potential effect on the broader system that governed her life. Doris sensed this immediately. The proposal did not feel like culmination, it felt like procedure. Her partner was evaluated thoroughly, his suitability assessed not by intimacy but by optics. He was considered in terms of temperament, discretion, resilience under pressure. Love, if it existed, was assumed to be incidental, pleasant but not essential. The marriage proceeded with confidence and caution in equal measure. There was celebration, yes, but it was measured. The event unfolded like a well-managed transition rather than an emotional threshold. Guests admired the elegance, the press approved, the system adjusted smoothly. For a time, Doris believed this might be enough. Marriage promised privacy of a sanctioned kind. Heiress, or a space where she could exist without constant supervision, where intimacy might finally be unmediated. Yet, even here, observation lingered. Expectations followed her into the relationship, shaping its contours before it could find its own rhythm. The experiment required results. She was expected to settle, to soften, to become less enigmatic. Marriage, it was assumed, would absorb her restlessness and return it as stability. If difficulties arose, they were interpreted as data, indicators that the model required adjustment. Emotion did not fit easily into this framework. Affection, when present, felt provisional. Arguments felt disproportionate, charged with implication beyond the immediate. Every disagreement seemed to echo outward, touching reputation, legacy, expectation. There was no room for messiness. Even conflict required decorum. Doris struggled with this. She had entered the marriage seeking relief from management, only to find that management had followed her. Inside. The union was monitored, discussed, interpreted. Silence was scrutinized, distance noted, happiness measured. The weight of the experiment pressed in quietly. She began to feel that her role was not to experience marriage, but to validate it, to demonstrate that she could conform to a model deemed appropriate for someone of her position. When the marriage faltered, it was not framed as failure of feeling, but as mismatch of structure. The experiment had yielded results, and the results were inconvenient. Rather than entrench her, marriage clarified the limits of containment. It revealed how little space existed for authenticity within approved arrangements. Doris recognized that no relationship could flourish while serving as proof of something else. When the union ended, it did so without drama. There were no public scenes, no protracted scandal. The separation unfolded as the marriage had, orderly, discreet, managed. Observers noted the civility. The system absorbed the disruption. Divorce, in her world, was not catastrophe. It was conclusion. The experiment had been conducted, the findings recorded. Marriage, it turned out, did not resolve what had been contained for so long. It merely illuminated it. Doris Duke emerged from the experience unchanged in status, but altered in understanding. She saw, perhaps for the first time, that no arrangement designed to stabilize her life would ever grant her ownership of it. Marriage had not failed. It had simply proven what could not be solved by structure alone. The marriage ended the way it had begun, quietly, competently, and without witnesses who lingered. There was no public reckoning, no dramatic retreat, no need for explanation beyond the most restrained phrasing. Papers were signed, statements prepared. The machinery that had once ushered her into marriage now guided her out of it with equal efficiency. If there was disappointment, it remained unspoken. If there was relief, it was never acknowledged aloud. Divorce, in Doris Duke's world, was not failure. It was an adjustment. The absence of scandal was not accidental. It was engineered. Reputation had long since learned how to protect itself, how to absorb rupture without allowing it to surface. Lawyers ensured separation was framed as mutual understanding. Advisors coordinated tone. The press received only what was necessary, enough to satisfy curiosity, never enough to provoke interpretation. Observers admired the restraint. They spoke of dignity, of maturity, of how well she handled it. The language suggested triumph through composure, as though the absence of spectacle were proof of strength rather than evidence of suppression. Doris accepted these compliments politely, though she sensed they were not addressed to her so much as to the system that had functioned flawlessly once again. Inside, the separation felt unreal. There was no clear ending to mark the experience, no dramatic before and after. The days simply resumed their familiar shape, altered only by omission. A presence disappeared, routines adjusted, life closed seamlessly around the absence. This was both mercy and erasure. Without scandal, there was no space for grief. Without conflict, no permission for anger. The relationship dissolved as though it had never quite existed, its significance diluted by discretion. Doris found herself uncertain what she was meant to feel. Relief, perhaps. Regret, possibly. But nothing strong enough to insist on recognition. The divorce left no visible wound. And yet, something essential had been exposed. Marriage had promised legitimacy, a sanctioned privacy, a reprieve from supervision. Its failure revealed that even sanctioned arrangements were subject to oversight, that no role she entered would ever fully belong to her. This realization settled slowly. Doris began to understand that her life was not designed to accommodate rupture. It was built to smooth it away. Anything that threatened equilibrium would be absorbed, managed, neutralized. The system did not punish deviation, it erased its significance. This erasure was more unsettling than condemnation. To separate without scandal meant to separate without acknowledgement. The experience was not allowed to define her or even alter perception. She remained the same figure, unchanged in public understanding, untouched by consequence. Freedom, she discovered, was not found in breaking away. It was lost in being returned to form. The absence of scrutiny did not feel like relief. It felt like containment. The divorce confirmed what marriage had begun to reveal, that her life would continue to be interpreted through stability rather than truth. Doris Duke emerged from the separation intact, as intended, but intactness had begun to feel less like protection and more like constraint. The smoothness with which her marriage disappeared underscored how little of her experience was permitted to leave a mark. Divorce without scandal preserves image, but it leaves the self unrecognized, its losses unspoken, its lessons privately absorbed. And so Doris moved forward once again, carrying a conclusion that the world had decided was unworthy of notice. The system had worked perfectly, and for the first time, that perfection felt like an indictment. Loneliness did not arrive abruptly in Doris Duke's life. It accumulated. It settled into corners the way dust does in rooms too carefully arranged to be disturbed. It gathered quietly, unnoticed by those who admired the elegance of her surroundings and mistook abundance for company. There was no single moment when she realized she was alone, only the gradual awareness that no one occupied the center of her life without permission. After the divorce, silence expanded. Not the silence of neglect, but the refined quiet of estates designed to absorb sound. Hallways lengthened, rooms grew more spacious, the air itself seemed trained to carry nothing urgent. Where conversation once occurred by obligation, now there was space, and that space filled itself with absence. Doris did not lack people. Staff remained attentive, advisors remained available. Guests arrived when invited and departed on schedule. Social obligations continued to populate her calendar, ensuring she was never visibly isolated. Yet intimacy, the unstructured presence of someone who stayed without instruction, remained elusive. Loneliness in her world wore velvet. It was cushioned by luxury, softened by distraction, disguised as independence. The ability to be alone was praised as strength. Solitude was reframed as refinement. Doris learned to accept this framing, even as she sensed something essential slipping out of reach. The houses she inhabited reinforced the illusion. They were furnished exquisitely, every object chosen for balance and harmony. Beauty surrounded her constantly, leaving little room for disorder or intrusion. Yet, beauty does not respond. It does not listen. It does not stay awake when unease surfaces at night. Doris became accustomed to evenings that unfolded without interruption. Meals eaten alone felt normal. Silence felt appropriate. Over time, even longing softened into something less defined, a vague awareness that something was missing without language to name it. Loneliness had been normalized. Her upbringing had prepared her for this. Emotional restraint, privacy rationed carefully, affection supervised, all had trained her to exist without reliance. She had learned to contain herself so well that isolation no longer registered as deprivation. It registered as expectation. Still, there were moments when the containment faltered. A conversation that lingered unexpectedly. A presence that did not withdraw at the appropriate time. In these moments, Doris felt a faint surge of recognition, a sense of connection that startled her by its intensity. Just as quickly, caution followed. Attachment invited complication. Complication invited intervention. And so she withdrew, restoring equilibrium. Loneliness, furnished beautifully, is difficult to confront because it appears intentional. Outsiders assumed she preferred it, that she enjoyed her independence, her privacy, her distance. The narrative suited everyone involved, including Doris herself, who had learned to perform self-sufficiency convincingly. But self-sufficiency can become isolation when it replaces choice. As the years passed, companionship became increasingly formalized. Relationships existed within defined roles: guest, advisor, benefactor, acquaintance. Rarely did anyone cross the invisible threshold into unstructured presence. The center remained unoccupied. Doris filled the space with objects, with projects, with movement. Travel became a way to disrupt stillness without challenging structure. New environments offered novelty without intimacy. They provided sensation without vulnerability. This worked, for a time, but loneliness, when ignored, does not disappear. It becomes quieter, more efficient, more deeply embedded. It stops announcing itself and begins shaping behavior from beneath awareness. Doris Duke lived within this refined solitude, her life outwardly full and inwardly spare. The world admired the grace with which she carried herself through it, never questioning the cost. Loneliness, after all, looks very different when it is upholstered in silk and silence. Movement became Doris Duke's most reliable refuge. When stillness grew too heavy, she did not confront it. She left. Trains, ships, automobiles, each offered the promise of interruption without explanation. Travel did not require justification. It was admired, encouraged, framed as cultivation. To be in motion was to appear engaged with the world, even if the engagement remained superficial. Her departures were always orderly. Bags were packed efficiently, routes planned carefully, accommodations prepared in advance. Nothing was improvised. Travel, like everything else in her life, occurred within structure, yet within that structure, she experienced something resembling relief. Motion disrupted routine. It fractured the quiet long enough to make breathing feel deliberate again. She became fluent in transit. Airports, hotels, villas, and estates across continents blurred together, each one offering the same controlled novelty. New rooms, new light, new sounds, all of it stimulating without being invasive. Travel allowed her to exist briefly without history pressing in from every corner. In unfamiliar places, expectations softened, observation thinned. For a time, this felt like freedom, yet motion is not escape. It is displacement. Doris carried her containment with her, neatly packed alongside her belongings. Wherever she went, the same patterns reasserted themselves. Privacy remained conditional. Interactions remained polite. Intimacy remained elusive. The scenery changed, but the atmosphere did not. Movement dulled restlessness without addressing it. She learned to associate departure with relief, arrival with disappointment. The anticipation mattered more than the destination. As soon as she settled somewhere, the quiet returned, softened by novelty, but unmistakable. The same sense of suspension followed her from place to place, Travel became a way of postponing recognition. Those around her praised her cosmopolitanism. They admired her curiosity, her willingness to engage with different cultures, different landscapes. They spoke of her mobility as privilege well used. No one asked what she was leaving behind each time she went. Doris rarely answered that question herself. In motion, she could avoid stillness. Stillness invited reflection. Reflection risked clarity. And clarity, she suspected, would be difficult to live with. She found comfort in schedules, departure times, itineraries, transitions. The predictability of movement reassured her. Even as she crossed borders, she remained within the same internal perimeter. Motion without transformation felt safer than confrontation. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when she sensed the futility of it. When a journey ended and she stood alone in yet another exquisitely prepared room, aware that nothing essential had shifted. The realization never lingered long enough to harden into despair. Another departure always followed. This pattern became habit. The heiress in motion appeared active, engaged, alive. In reality, she was circling an absence she could not name. Travel allowed her to stay occupied without becoming anchored. It kept her from stagnating while ensuring she never arrived. Movement gave shape to her days without giving them direction. As years passed, the distances grew longer, the stays shorter. Home became a concept rather than a location. Everywhere felt temporary. Nothing demanded permanence. Doris Duke mastered this rhythm, moving through the world with elegance and restraint. She was admired for her restlessness, never pitied for it. The narrative framed her as curious, adventurous, self-directed. Only she knew that motion had become a substitute, not for purpose, but for presence. The heiress kept moving, and the quiet followed, patiently, wherever she went. Health, like everything else in Doris Duke's life, was never allowed to exist without interpretation. It was not merely a condition of the body, it was a story to be told correctly. Symptoms were noted, evaluated, contextualized. Discomfort was translated into acceptable terminology before it could become alarming. Doctors spoke with assurance. Reports arrived precise and reassuring. The language of medicine, clean and authoritative, replaced the language of uncertainty. Illness, if it appeared, was handled quietly. There were appointments scheduled discreetly, consultations conducted behind closed doors, treatments administered without drama. The goal was never confrontation, it was continuity. Health was something to be maintained in the background, not experienced openly. Weakness, like grief, was permitted only in forms that did not interrupt function. Doris learned early that her body was not solely her own. It belonged in part to reputation. Any visible fragility risked speculation. Any prolonged absence invited curiosity. And curiosity, once awakened, could not be easily controlled. The narrative had to remain stable, composed heiress, resilient, unaffected. Pain, when it surfaced, was reframed. Fatigue became overwork. Anxiety became restlessness. Emotional distress was softened into temperament. Nothing was allowed to appear urgent or unresolved. Even suffering was edited for tone. This created a peculiar distance between Doris and her own physical experience. Sensations were filtered through professionals before being acknowledged. She learned to distrust her instincts, to wait for validation before accepting discomfort as real. If the doctors were calm, she remained calm. If they minimized, she complied. Health became a matter of compliance rather than awareness. The medical authority surrounding her spoke with confidence, and she had been raised to respect confidence above all else. Their assurances felt comforting, even when they contradicted her intuition. She learned to accept treatment without understanding, to endure without protest. This suited the system well. A body that does not complain is easier to manage. A patient who does not insist is more predictable. Doris, already trained in restraint, adapted seamlessly to this role. She became an exemplary subject, cooperative, composed, undemanding. Yet beneath this calm, unease lingered. There were moments when she sensed that something essential was being overlooked, that health was being treated as an image rather than an experience. She could not articulate this discomfort without sounding ungrateful or hysterical, labels that carried their own consequences. So she remained silent. The narrative continued uninterrupted. Doris Duke was healthy. Doris Duke was fine. Doris Duke was well cared for. The repetition of these statements made them feel true, even when she felt otherwise. Over time, this narrative shaped her relationship to her own vulnerability. She learned to conceal weakness even from herself, to interpret discomfort as temporary, to trust that professionals would intervene if something truly mattered. But what qualifies as truly mattered? In a life designed to minimize disruption, thresholds rise. Pain must be severe to be acknowledged. Fatigue must be extreme. Emotional distress must manifest physically before it is legitimized. This left Doris suspended between sensation and permission. Health, managed so carefully, became another form of containment. It ensured that her body, like her fortune, remained presentable, predictable, and intact. It preserved the appearance of stability at the expense of self-trust. The cost of this management was subtle but enduring. Doris Duke lived inside a body that had learned to behave, to endure quietly, to signal distress softly, to submit to interpretation. Her health story was always told for her, never by her. And like all well-managed narratives, it left very little room for truth to interrupt. Control in Doris Duke's life never arrived wearing the uniform of authority. It did not command or correct. It did not punish. It reassured. This was its most effective disguise. Everything around her suggested choice. She could travel where she wished, acquire what she pleased, arrange her days with apparent freedom. No one stood in her way. No doors were visibly locked, yet every path she took had been smoothed in advance, every alternative quietly narrowed until it no longer presented itself as viable. Control, when perfected, feels like agreement. The people guiding her. Life spoke of autonomy often. They emphasized her independence, her sophistication, her ability to decide for herself. This language mattered. It preserved the illusion that she was acting freely, even as the structure around her ensured that freedom never wandered far from expectation. She learned to recognize which desires would be welcomed and which would require explanation. Over time, she stopped desiring the latter altogether. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. Her world rewarded predictability. When she followed established rhythms, approval flowed effortlessly. When she deviated, attention sharpened, conversations lengthened, concern appeared, framed as care. Nothing was forbidden outright, but the cost of insisting became clear. Insistence required stamina. It demanded conflict. Doris, long trained in composure, learned to avoid both. This was how control moved inward. No one needed to intervene when she had already internalized the limits. She questioned herself before anyone else could. She adjusted expectations to fit what was practical, reasonable, acceptable. The system no longer needed to assert itself. It lived comfortably inside her decision-making. What made this control so difficult to name was its kindness. There was no cruelty to resist, no injustice to confront. Everything was done in her supposed best interest. Protection, stability, continuity, these were noble goals. To oppose them felt ungrateful, even dangerous. The system had given her so much. What right did she have to ask for more? Yet beneath this generosity lay an unspoken premise that her life required supervision to remain intact. Doris Duke understood this intuitively. She sensed that trust in her judgment was conditional, granted only so long as her judgment aligned with precedent. Innovation was welcomed in art, in taste, in philanthropy, never in self-definition. The control she lived under did not suppress her, it preserved her. Preservation, however, carries a cost. It resists change. It prioritizes sameness over growth. Over time, Doris felt herself becoming a fixed object, admired, maintained, protected, rather than a person in motion. She could not point to the moment this happened. There was no dramatic shift. Control never announced itself. It settled gradually into routine, into expectation, into identity. The most unsettling realization came quietly, that she had learned to confuse safety with fulfillment. Her life was secure. It was orderly. It was admired. And yet, it felt incomplete in a way she could not articulate. Something essential remained untouched, not because it was forbidden, but because it had never been encouraged. Control that never looks like control is almost impossible to escape. There's nothing to rebel against, no oppressor to confront, only a series of reasonable decisions that, taken together, form a cage without bars. Doris Duke lived inside that cage gracefully, convincingly, and for many years without protest. The world saw a woman perfectly at ease within her fortune. Only she knew how carefully that ease had been constructed, and how difficult it would be to imagine herself beyond it. The houses began to accumulate quietly, one after another, until they no longer felt like choices but inevitabilities. Each new property arrived with a rationale already prepared, a climate more suitable, a location of cultural significance, a retreat for privacy, a place to entertain correctly. No single home was ever described as excess. Each was framed as necessary, even practical, within the logic of her life. And so the collection grew. Estates in different regions offered different versions of calm. One emphasized seclusion, another refinement, another proximity to art or society. Together, they formed a network of refuge, places where Doris Duke could disappear without explanation and reappear without consequence. Home in this arrangement became plural. No single location claimed permanence. Each residence was impeccably maintained, yet none felt fully inhabited. Personal objects moved between them selectively, never enough to create disorder. Staff ensured continuity of atmosphere so that regardless of geography, the experience remained familiar. This sameness was intentional. The houses were not meant to reflect her inner life. They were designed to neutralize it. Wherever she went, the environment reassured her that nothing essential had changed. The same quiet luxury, the same measured distances, the same absence of urgency. Movement between homes offered novelty without rupture. If one space grew too heavy, another awaited. Loneliness could be relocated. Discomfort could be deferred. There was always somewhere else to go, a privilege that appeared enviable from the outside and deeply numbing from within. Doris began to understand that ownership did not equate to belonging. The houses belonged to her, legally and symbolically. But she belonged to none of them. They existed to serve her needs without ever demanding presence. No home required her to stay. No room insisted on memory. This created a life without anchor. Friends and acquaintances spoke of her residences with admiration, cataloging them as achievements. The houses became part of her public identity, evidence of taste, culture, reach. Yet each new acquisition diluted the significance of the last. Nothing held its place long enough to become irreplaceable. The multiplication of homes mirrored the diffusion of self. Instead of deepening attachment, it prevented it. Instead of creating roots, it ensured mobility. Doris lived everywhere and nowhere, carried by the same routine across changing backdrops. She began to feel like a guest in her own life. Even the most intimate spaces, bedrooms, studies, sitting rooms, felt provisional. They awaited her arrival and tolerated her absence with equal ease. There was no sense of disruption when she left. The houses did not miss her. This was the unspoken cost of abundance. When shelter multiplies, sanctuary dissolves, comfort becomes generic, safety loses specificity. There is no single place where one must return, no space that demands loyalty. Doris adapted to this effortlessly. She had been trained for it. Attachment had always been provisional. Presence had always been negotiated. The houses simply extended that logic into architecture. They offered beauty without insistence. And yet, on rare occasions, she felt the absence sharply, usually in transition between departures and arrivals, when the illusion of home momentarily fractured. In those moments, she sensed how little any of these spaces knew her, or required her, or held her history in a way that could not be replicated elsewhere. The houses multiplied, and with them, the distance between Doris Duke and the idea of home. She had places to stay endlessly, but nowhere that asked her to remain. Objects began to arrive before desire had time to announce itself. They came as gifts, acquisitions, inheritances folded into purchase orders, each accompanied by explanation, provenance, reassurance, artifacts from distant places, textiles softened by centuries of use, sculptures shaped by hands long vanished. The world, it seemed, was willing to be gathered and arranged at her feet. Collecting, for Doris Duke, was never framed as indulgence. It was described as appreciation. She was told she had an eye, that her instincts were refined, that she possessed a natural sensitivity to beauty and history. These compliments arrived so consistently that they felt like instruction. To collect was not merely acceptable, it was expected. It gave form to her mobility. It gave purpose to her movement through cultures she would never fully inhabit. Objects offered something people rarely did: permanence without demand. They did not require explanation. They did not ask questions. They could be admired, rearranged, stored, revisited, all without consequence. In their presence, Doris felt a sense of control that had long eluded her elsewhere. Acquisition was one of the few acts she could perform without negotiation. And so she gathered. Rooms filled quietly with meaning that did not press back. Art became environment rather than encounter. Each piece carried a story she could choose to learn or ignore. History arrived curated, stripped of urgency. The past became something beautiful and inert. There was comfort in this. Collecting allowed Doris to engage with the world at a safe distance. Cultures could be admired without obligation, rituals appreciated without participation. The complexities of other lives flattened into objects that asked only to be placed correctly. Over time, the collection grew extensive. It became a reflection not of excess, but of absence. Each object stood in for something ungraspable: intimacy, continuity, belonging. Together, they created the illusion of connection without requiring vulnerability. She learned to move among her possessions with practiced familiarity. Objects replaced people as companions in stillness. They filled rooms that might otherwise echo. They gave texture to silence. This was not hoarding. It was substitution. The act of collecting satisfied an urge to anchor herself in something tangible. When relationships remained unstable or conditional, objects offered certainty. They stayed where she left them. They did not reinterpret her. They did not require approval. Yet even this control was partial. As the collection expanded, it attracted its own infrastructure. Curators, conservators, advisors, all eager to assist, to guide, to protect value. Decisions about care and display reintroduced mediation. Even ownership began to feel abstract, filtered through expertise. Still, Doris persisted. Collecting became a way to externalize her inner life without exposing it. Each acquisition allowed her to express preference without explanation. Taste replaced confession. Arrangement replaced intimacy. The world admired her collections, spoke of them as legacy. Museums courted her. Scholars praised her discernment. The objects conferred status, reinforcing her identity as custodian rather than participant. And perhaps that was the appeal. To collect the world is to hold it still, to prevent it from demanding response. Doris Duke surrounded herself with beauty that could not disappoint her, that could not leave, that could not ask for more than care. In this way, the collection grew not as excess, but as armor. It protected her from the unpredictability of human connection while offering the illusion of engagement. She could walk through centuries without ever being required to live fully in her own. The world, gathered piece by piece, stood quietly around her, and in its silence, it reflected her own. Art entered Doris Duke's life not as provocation, but as presence. Paintings did not challenge her. Sculptures did not accuse. They occupied space with composure, offering beauty that asked nothing in return. Unlike people, art did not watch her back. It did not require explanation, reassurance, or response. It simply remained. This suited her. Her collections were displayed with care, yet without spectacle. Rooms were arranged to encourage contemplation rather than conversation. Lighting softened edges. Distances were measured. Nothing crowded. Nothing demanded attention louder than anything else. Art existed as atmosphere, not event. There were no gatherings around it. Visitors admired quietly, speaking in lowered tones as though in a chapel. Experts offered interpretations, but rarely in her presence. Curators cataloged, conservators preserved. The objects accumulated meaning through proximity, not through dialogue. Art was observed, not discussed. Doris preferred it this way. Witness implies participation. It suggests an exchange. Someone seeing, someone responding. Her art was not meant to be witnessed so much as maintained. It lived with her, but did not look at her. It did not ask what she felt when she stood before it, or why she returned to certain pieces again and again. Art without witness becomes a private language. In this language, Doris could exist without interruption. She could move among centuries without being required to belong to any of them. The works did not reflect her life back to her. They absorbed her presence without comment, allowing her to stand still in ways that people never did. This absence of witness felt safe. In earlier years, she had learned that being seen often led to correction. Attention sharpened boundaries. Observation invited management. Art offered a rare reprieve, a space where she could linger without consequence, where her reactions did not require translation. Yet, this safety carried its own isolation. Art, after all, does not respond. It does not recognize the viewer. It does not confirm existence through reciprocity. Doris could admire endlessly without ever being met. The silence she encountered in these rooms mirrored the silence she carried within herself. Over time, she began to prefer it. Witness introduces risk. A witness remembers. A witness interprets. A witness might misunderstand. Art, unobserved by others, remained pure, untouched by scrutiny, safe from misreading. Her collections became internal landscapes rather than public statements. They recorded her presence without narrating it. If there was emotion, it remained suspended between object and observer, never articulated. This arrangement allowed her to feel something adjacent to intimacy without vulnerability. Art did not disappoint her. It did not leave. It did not betray expectation. It did not require compromise. In return, she did not ask it to console her. The relationship remained balanced, distant, controlled. The world admired her taste, her discernment, her dedication to preservation. They praised her as patron, custodian, benefactor. These roles suited her. They emphasized responsibility without demanding exposure. Art without witness does not transform. It stabilizes. Doris Duke stood among her collections not as participant in a cultural conversation, but as caretaker of stillness. The works around her absorbed time, history, and attention, yet reflected nothing back. They allowed her to exist without narrative, without interpretation. In those rooms, nothing asked her who she was, and so she remained there often, surrounded by beauty that did not speak, comforted by art that required no witness, and offered none in return. Giving entered Doris Duke's life as obligation long before it resembled choice. From the moment her fortune was acknowledged publicly, it carried an expectation, not merely of generosity, but of justification. Wealth of that scale required explanation. Philanthropy provided it. To give was to correct imbalance, to soften perception, to demonstrate responsibility where excess might otherwise provoke discomfort. Charity, in this context, was not spontaneous. It was strategic. Advisors spoke of impact, of legacy, of stewardship. Causes were evaluated for alignment, visibility, respectability. The language surrounding philanthropy echoed the language of management that had shaped her life since childhood. Funds were allocated, outcomes measured, reputation preserved. Doris learned quickly that generosity was safest when it appeared deliberate. Giving offered her a sanctioned outlet for agency. It allowed her to act without resistance, to move resources according to preference within approved boundaries. Unlike personal decisions, philanthropy was encouraged. It signaled maturity, responsibility, usefulness. In this way, giving became one of the few arenas where action was rewarded rather than moderated. Yet even here, her autonomy was incomplete. Philanthropy required consultation. Boards formed, experts advised, causes were framed. Doris's name attached itself to institutions, not individuals. The distance between giver and recipient remained intact, preserving dignity on both sides, but also preventing connection. Charity corrected perception more effectively than it addressed need. The act of giving smoothed the edges of her fortune, reframing it as benevolent rather than excessive. It reassured the public that wealth could be ethical, that privilege could be responsible. Doris understood this implicitly. She sensed that her generosity served a function beyond compassion. It maintained balance. When criticism hovered, philanthropy absorbed it. When questions arose, donations answered them. The more visible the giving, the less visible the fortune itself became. Charity acted as insulation, buffering her from scrutiny while affirming her role as custodian rather than consumer. This suited the system well. For Doris, philanthropy carried a quieter significance. It offered purpose without exposure. She could direct energy outward without revealing inward need. The causes she supported mattered, but they did not demand her presence. She remained at a safe remove, generous but unseen. This arrangement felt familiar. She had been raised to understand responsibility as distance, to care without intrusion, to assist without attachment. Philanthropy mirrored this ethic perfectly. It allowed her to act without complicating her life with unpredictability. Still, there were moments of dissonance. She sensed that giving was expected of her, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Her generosity did not belong solely to her. It was part of the maintenance of her image, her legacy, her position within a larger narrative about wealth behaving properly. Philanthropy became a form of correction. It corrected the imbalance between private abundance and public discomfort. It corrected the narrative of inheritance by replacing passivity with action. It corrected the unease others felt toward fortunes that appeared unearned. What it did not correct was her own sense of disconnection. Giving did not bring her closer to others. It reinforced distance, formalizing compassion into structure. The more she gave, the more abstract the act became. The beneficiaries remained faceless. Gratitude arrived mediated, filtered through letters and reports. This was not cruelty. It was design. Doris Duke fulfilled her role as benefactor with seriousness and restraint. She gave generously, thoughtfully, consistently. The world applauded, institutions flourished, causes advanced, and yet philanthropy did not resolve the quiet question beneath it all. Whether generosity performed as duty could ever replace the intimacy of being needed by another human being. Philanthropy corrected perception. It did not correct loneliness. Applause followed Doris Duke wherever. Doris Duke. She went, though it rarely reached her ears directly. It arrived mediated, through headlines softened by admiration, through speeches delivered at a polite distance, through letters written in careful gratitude. The public spoke well of her. They praised her generosity, her restraint, her seriousness. Her name carried a tone of approval, as though she had fulfilled an obligation simply by existing correctly. This approval never felt personal. The applause was for the idea of her, not the woman herself. It celebrated the heiress who behaved as she should, discreet, charitable, controlled. It rewarded her for remaining legible within a narrative others found comforting, that wealth, when handled properly, could be harmless. Doris accepted this applause with composure. She had been trained to. She understood that public attention functioned best when kept abstract. Applause was not an invitation to speak. It was a signal to remain consistent. The more she adhered to expectation, the more approval followed. Deviations invited curiosity. Curiosity invited scrutiny. And scrutiny, she had learned, was rarely kind. So she stayed quiet. Public appearances were measured, infrequent, purposeful. She spoke when required, never more than necessary. Her words were polished, her tone calm. She offered gratitude, expressed commitment, reaffirmed responsibility. The audience responded warmly. Then she returned to silence. This rhythm became familiar. Public affirmation followed by private withdrawal, recognition without engagement, approval without connection. The applause confirmed that she was doing something right, without ever clarifying what that something was meant to feel like. In private, the quiet expanded. Away from ceremonies and statements, there was no audience, no feedback, no applause. The rooms absorbed sound, as they always had. Silence returned to its habitual place, undisturbed by acclaim. Doris noticed the contrast more acutely as time passed. Public spaces demanded nothing of her beyond appearance. Private spaces asked even less. The difference between them narrowed until both felt equally distant. Applause did not invigorate her. Silence did not distress her. Both existed as conditions to be endured rather than experiences to be felt. She began to sense that the world expected her gratitude for this arrangement, After all, she was admired, she was respected. She was spared the cruelties of public scrutiny that plagued others of her stature. Her privacy was protected even as her name remained visible. This was considered success. Yet, success without participation feels hollow. Doris Duke was applauded for generosity she rarely witnessed firsthand, for restraint she had never consciously chosen, for dignity she had learned out of necessity rather than conviction. The public narrative celebrated her stability while ignoring the cost of maintaining it. The applause never asked her how she felt. It did not inquire whether the life she lived aligned with the life she might have wanted. It did not notice the absence beneath the achievement. Applause does not listen, it affirms, and affirmation, when constant, becomes another form of containment. Doris learned to inhabit this space between recognition and isolation gracefully. She understood that to speak beyond expectation risked misunderstanding. Silence preserved clarity. Silence preserved approval. So she remained silent. The public continued to applaud. The private world remained quiet. Between the two, Doris Duke existed as a figure admired for her composure and little else, a life affirmed from a distance, never entered, never truly known. Applause echoed briefly. Silence endured. At a certain point, Doris Duke ceased to be interpreted as a person at all. She became a structure. Her name no longer referred solely to an individual, but to a set of expectations, procedures, and assurances. It appeared on letterheads, plaques, endowments, and programs. It functioned as a guarantee of funding, of seriousness, of continuity. To invoke her name was to signal stability. This transformation occurred gradually, without declaration. It emerged through repetition, through committees formed in her presence, through projects that proceeded regardless of her attendance, through decisions made in anticipation of what she would approve. Over time, her preferences became policy. Her temperament became precedent. Doris Duke, the woman, remained present. But Doris Duke, the institution, had begun to operate independently. People approached her not with requests, but with proposals already shaped to fit what they believed she represented. They did not ask who she was. They assumed. They spoke to her carefully, as one speaks to something permanent. Deference replaced curiosity. Familiarity disappeared. This was not reverence, it was administration. She felt it most acutely in conversation. Personal questions fell away. Discussions turned practical, strategic, abstract. She was consulted, not confided in. Included, but never surprised. Her reactions mattered only insofar as they aligned with expectation. To be an institution is to be predictable. Doris understood this instinctively. She sensed that deviation would cause confusion rather than concern. People did not know how to respond to unpredictability from something meant to endure. Spontaneity felt inappropriate, even threatening, in her presence. So she remained consistent. Her composure hardened into identity. Her restraint became her defining feature. The more she embodied reliability, the more others relied on it. The system reinforced itself, using her steadiness as justification for further abstraction. She watched this happen with quiet detachment. There was no resentment, only recognition. She'd been shaped for this role since childhood. Her upbringing, her management, her careful navigation of life had prepared her to become exactly this, a figure who could be trusted not to disrupt. Yet becoming an institution requires sacrifice. Institutions do not express doubt. They do not hesitate publicly. They do not change course easily. They persist, even when the people inside them grow tired. Doris felt this weight settling over her as years passed, the sense that her own flexibility was diminishing, not through age, but through expectation. Her name had become heavier than her voice. When she spoke, people listened politely, but they listened more closely to what her silence implied. When she hesitated, advisors interpreted. When she expressed interest, committees formed. Her presence generated momentum she did not always intend. This created a distance between intention and outcome. She could no longer act without consequence. Even modest gestures rippled outward, altering plans and priorities. This made her cautious. The cost of movement increased. Stillness felt safer. The irony was stark. Institutions exist to support individuals, yet Doris found herself supporting the institution that bore her name. She maintained its image, upheld its reliability, ensured its continuity, often at the expense of her own spontaneity. She did not protest this transformation. Protest requires belief in an alternative. Doris had lived too long within systems designed to absorb resistance. She adapted, as she always had, becoming what was required of her. The world found comfort in this. They trusted her because she never surprised them. They admired her because she endured. They relied on her because she behaved like infrastructure, solid, dependable, invisible. But institutions do not feel. And in becoming one, Doris Duke felt herself receding, not disappearing, but settling into the background of her own life, preserved, respected, and profoundly alone. Scandal approached Doris Duke more than once, but it never arrived with force. It hovered instead, suggested, murmured, hinted at, in tones that stopped short of accusation. Stories surfaced and then softened. Questions appeared and were quietly redirected. What might have erupted around another life dissolved into ambiguity around hers. This was not luck. It was the consequence of insulation so thorough that even disruption lost momentum upon contact. The system surrounding Doris did not deny scandal. It diluted it. It allowed just enough acknowledgement to prevent escalation, then absorbed the rest into procedure. When rumors surfaced, they were treated as misunderstandings. When criticism appeared, it was reframed as curiosity. When mistakes were made, they were contextualized, never excused, never condemned, simply explained away as complexity. Scandal in her world was managed like weather, prepared for, monitored, and rendered harmless through anticipation. Advisors knew how narratives formed and where they could be interrupted. Lawyers understood the value of silence over denial. The press received access selectively, rewarded for restraint. Doris learned to remain still when attention sharpened. Movement invited interpretation. Silence allowed the moment to pass. She had been trained for this response since childhood, to endure scrutiny without reacting, to allow systems to work on her behalf. And they did. What might have become defining moments in another life faded into footnotes in hers. The absence of spectacle preserved continuity. Observers noted the restraint, admired the dignity, moved on. Yet something lingered beneath this smoothness. Scandals that never fully land do not disappear. They remain suspended, unresolved, leaving behind a residue of unease. Doris sensed this, the feeling that truths had brushed past her life without ever being confronted. She did not experience vindication or condemnation. She experienced deferral. This deferral reinforced her distance from consequence. Actions did not lead clearly to outcomes. Mistakes did not demand reckoning. The world responded to her not with judgment, but with management. This created a peculiar unreality. Without consequence, experience loses weight. Without resolution, events feel provisional. Doris moved through moments that should have altered her trajectory without ever feeling the impact. Life continued, unchanged, as though nothing of significance had occurred. From the outside, this looked like privilege, and it was. But privilege without confrontation breeds detachment. Doris found it increasingly difficult to gauge the meaning of her own actions when the world refused to respond honestly to them. Praise felt automatic. Criticism felt distant. Everything was mediated. The scandals that never fully landed confirmed what she had long suspected, that her life existed in a protected layer, insulated not only from harm, but from truth. She could not tell where she stood because the ground never shifted beneath her. This made self-assessment nearly impossible. Without feedback, growth stalled. Reflection circled without resolution. Doris became adept at endurance, but not at change. The system that shielded her from disgrace also shielded her from clarity. And so she lived on, her name remaining intact, her reputation unmarred, her life uninterrupted. The world saw composure and continuity. What it did not see was the quiet erosion beneath, the way unresolved moments accumulated, unprocessed, leaving behind a life smooth on the surface and strangely hollow underneath. Scandals that never fully land do not destroy a life. They preserve it exactly as it is. The press never ignored Doris Duke. It simply chose its distance carefully. Articles appeared with regularity, her name surfacing in columns that spoke of philanthropy, taste, discretion. Reporters described her movements in gentle terms, never lingering too long, never pressing too hard. Even curiosity arrived softened, wrapped in courtesy. This was not indifference. It was understanding. The press knew what kind of figure she was meant to be. An heiress of the old order. A custodian of restraint, a woman whose life was not to be interrogated but acknowledged. To probe too deeply would have felt improper, even rude, an intrusion into a privacy that wealth had rendered sacrosanct. And so they looked away at precisely the right moments. When events hinted at complexity, coverage shifted tone, language became vague, timelines blurred, focus returned to safer ground, charity, legacy, elegance. The narrative corrected itself before deviation could take hold. Doris recognized this pattern early. She noticed how questions were asked gently, then abandoned. How interviews lingered on surface details, never venturing inward. How her silence was interpreted as dignity rather than evasion. The press did not challenge her, because it did not know how to frame her as anything other than composed. This arrangement suited everyone involved. The media avoided confrontation. Doris avoided exposure. The public received a story that reassured rather than unsettled. No one demanded more than what was offered. Yet this mutual restraint carried an unspoken cost. The press, by looking away, removed one of the few forces capable of disrupting narrative. Journalism, at its most honest, introduces friction. It asks inconvenient questions. It resists presentation. In Doris Duke's case, that friction was absent. Her life unfolded without interrogation. This did not feel like protection. It felt like erasure. Without scrutiny, moments that might have been understood were instead flattened. Experiences that could have been contextualized were left isolated. Doris existed publicly as a silhouette, recognizable, admired, but indistinct. She began to sense that the press was less interested in her life than in preserving an idea of stability. She represented continuity in a changing world. To challenge her story would have challenged the comfort she symbolized. So the press complied. They framed her as she had been framed since childhood, responsibly, respectfully, without urgency. Her voice appeared only when it aligned with expectation. Silence filled the rest. Doris did not resent this. Resentment requires belief that something has been taken. She had grown accustomed to having parts of her life remain unexamined. Still, she sensed the distortion. Without honest attention, experience loses definition. Life becomes anecdotal rather than examined. The press that looked away did not lie. It simply chose not to see. And in doing so, it reinforced the isolation that had shaped her since youth. Doris lived publicly without being known, her story told in fragments that never assembled into truth. The world read about her often. It never read her. This absence of witness echoed the absence she had long carried, a life observed only at safe angles, never illuminated fully. The press, like so many others, treated her as something to be maintained rather than understood. And so the narrative remained intact, smooth, uninterrupted, a surface polished so thoroughly that nothing beneath it could ever catch the light. Doris Duke's existence unfolded like a journey without destination. One estate gave way to another with such predictability that transition itself became ritual. Mornings began in rooms meticulously arranged, with objects positioned to reassure and routines structured to maintain calm. By afternoon, she might find herself miles away in another residence equally prepared, equally insulated, equally silent. The movement was continuous, but it rarely felt like freedom. Each home was distinct, yet fundamentally the same. One offered seclusion, another society, a third proximity to art or philanthropy. Each arrived pre-configured, equipped with staff who anticipated her needs, rooms that softened the harsh edges of reality, and atmospheres designed to regulate feeling. She could occupy these spaces with ease, yet they never anchored her. They were points along a carefully measured path, not havens to claim as her own. The transition between estates was as important as presence within them. Carriages, trains, and eventually automobiles carried her from one to the next, each journey planned, timed, and observed. Staff traveled ahead, ensuring conditions remained exact. Rooms were warmed, lights adjusted, food prepared, even absence was orchestrated so that it left no trace, so that nothing essential would feel disrupted. In this network, Doris became fluent in adaptation. She could enter any space, assume the appropriate posture, engage in the necessary tasks, and depart without friction. Familiarity replaced curiosity. Efficiency replaced engagement. The world outside these walls mattered, but only as backdrop. Inside, every interaction, every object, every routine had been engineered to preserve balance. Yet balance comes at a cost. Living between estates created a subtle dislocation. Even the most intimate rooms, bedrooms, studies, sitting rooms, felt provisional. Objects traveled with her, yet they never accumulated enough permanence to feel like possessions. Relationships were always filtered through distance and expectation. Companionship was scheduled, privacy conditional. She existed in a series of prepared environments rather than a single home, and with each relocation, the sense of temporariness deepened. Doris moved through her life like a figure in a well-rehearsed performance, capable of responding with grace, but rarely encountering anything unplanned. Freedom existed, but only in the abstract. Desire and impulse were checked by logistics, supervision, and the invisible expectation that she remain composed. This constant motion reinforced isolation. Even while surrounded by luxury, staff, or visitors, she experienced a persistent separation between self and world. The estates absorbed her presence, providing comfort, but not connection. The scenery changed, but the underlying rhythm of expectation, observation, and containment remained the same. Over time, the spaces began to merge. The pattern of arrival and departure, of observation and control, created a life defined not by location, but by procedure. Doris's identity became intertwined with the act of moving itself, an existence suspended between prepared rooms, each designed to preserve appearance, prevent error, and minimize disruption. In this continuity, she was both present and absent. Her body occupied space, her name commanded attention, her fortune inspired respect. Yet her inner life remained private, untested, unobserved. The estates offered beauty, comfort, and safety, but they could not provide belonging. They could shelter her from chaos, but not from solitude. And so Doris Duke lived as she always had, carried along by design, contained by expectation, moving endlessly through spaces that ensured she remained intact, admired, and profoundly alone. To be untouchable is to exist beyond ordinary consequence. Doris Duke learned this early, long before she understood what it truly meant. Her life was surrounded by layers of wealth, of protocol, of observation, each designed to prevent harm, to maintain stability, to render error nearly impossible. She moved within this cocoon as though it were air itself, necessary, invisible, and inescapable. Being untouchable was a kind of immunity that demanded perfection. She could not falter openly. A misstep in behavior might ripple outward, interpreted by advisors, trustees, or society as weakness. Even minor indiscretions were corrected before they became visible, redirected into the channels of decorum and discretion. The system surrounding her acted with precision, absorbing deviation, smoothing surfaces, preserving appearances. Mistakes existed only as whispers in reports or private discussions, never as evidence in the world that mattered. This protective network created a strange isolation. To be shielded from consequence is to live without friction. Friction sharpens thought, defines boundaries, shapes decisions. Without it, life becomes a series of rehearsed movements, steps repeated with elegance, always within the lines, always visible, yet never truly known. Doris grew accustomed to this rhythm, performing the role expected of her with care, grace, and consistency. She was admired for it, yet the admiration came from distance. The paradox of untouchability is its cost. When nothing can harm, nothing can challenge. When safety is absolute, growth slows. Doris learned to navigate her world without error, but she also learned that the absence of challenge left her understanding incomplete. She could act and observe, but never confront. She could excel, but never stumble in ways that illuminated her own boundaries. Even intimacy was mediated. Relationships arrived pre-approved, interactions shaped by expectation, attachments managed by those who understood the stakes. To be untouchable is to be isolated from the unfiltered responses of others. People approached her carefully, admired her, but never tested her. Affection, if it appeared, existed within defined limits. Desire had to be calibrated. Vulnerability was permitted only insofar as it did not threaten stability. The world praised her restraint. It recognized the composure she displayed, the elegance she maintained, the decisions she navigated with care. Yet this recognition rarely acknowledged the cost behind it, the suppression of impulses, the constant awareness of scrutiny, the quiet loneliness of a life unassailable yet incomplete. Doris existed as exemplar, institution, figurehead, untouchable, and therefore profoundly untethered. Even wealth contributed to the separation. Money insulated her from want, from error, from challenge. It offered comfort without obligation. It absorbed consequence before it reached her. Yet in preserving life from hardship, it also preserved it from learning. The same fortune that allowed her to travel the world, to acquire objects, to influence culture, also ensured that nothing touched her in ways that might have been formative. Being untouchable demands vigilance. Doris internalized the system, moving through it with instinctive care. She anticipated scrutiny before it appeared. She moderated impulses before they could be observed. She performed composure as naturally as breathing. And in doing so, she fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, even as she lost the ability to measure herself by ordinary standards. The price of immunity is invisibility. Doris Duke, admired, wealthy, protected, moved gracefully through life. Yet she moved alone, carrying within her the weight of a perfection that had never been asked for, but which the world demanded, a life untouchable, intact, and profoundly solitary. Time approached. Time, Doris Duke as it does all lives, but it did not arrive in ordinary increments. It passed with quiet accumulation, measured not by milestones or folly, but by observation and preservation. Each year added layers to her presence, subtle shifts in posture, the softening of voice, the glint in eyes tempered by experience. Yet beneath these superficial signs, the mechanisms of control remained unchanged, leaving age without its usual concession to imperfection. The world anticipated her transformation, but it arrived differently than expected. Observers spoke of grace, of elegance maintained into maturity, of refinement deepened by years. They admired her discipline, her ability to move through decades with composure intact. They did not notice that time had begun to operate invisibly, shaping the margins of her life without ever touching its center. She aged without scandal, without deviation, without the wrinkles of consequence that often accompany visibility. In private, Doris felt the subtle weight of duration. Days stretched and folded in repetition, the pattern as predictable as the estates she moved between. Even the passage of seasons seemed to obey schedule, providing distraction without disruption. She measured time through events meticulously curated: travel, art acquisition, philanthropy, and public appearances. Each marked a year, each reinforced the constancy of expectation, each reinforced the unspoken rule that she remain unaltered. Her body changed inevitably, yet without violation. Signs of age emerged in ways permitted by discretion. Skin softened, hands lost some elasticity, hair lightened under the careful attention of stylists. The physical evidence of passing years was managed, presented with subtlety, never allowed to dominate perception. Aging became another layer of refinement rather than a marker of fragility. The world perceived her continuity. She perceived the persistence of attention. Social expectation evolved alongside her, yet remained unwavering. She was expected to maintain influence, to project judgment, to embody taste. Maturity heightened admiration, yet also reinforced surveillance. People regarded her decisions with the same measured attention as before, evaluating composure, discretion, and alignment with precedent. Age did not excuse deviation, it amplified responsibility. To misstep would have seemed unnatural, even dangerous. Doris understood this instinctively. Experience offered her little refuge. While others might soften with age, releasing control, permitting indulgence, embracing idiosyncrasy, Doris's environment left no allowance for such liberties. Every action continued to be monitored, every gesture measured. The accumulation of years did not reduce oversight, it intensified subtle expectation. The wisdom of experience became another instrument of compliance rather than emancipation. Yet there were moments when she felt the passing of time profoundly. Even in managed solitude, she sensed the quiet erosion of opportunity, the gentle vanishing of potential that might have existed outside her prescribed life. Reflection arrived unbidden, tempered by awareness that the world would not accommodate dissent. Nostalgia was permitted, but only in muted tones, never loud enough to disturb perception. Age in her life became both shield and cage. It protected her from scrutiny's harshness while ensuring that she remained predictable, admired, intact. It allowed continuity without disruption, presence without chaos, and in doing so, it imposed a different kind of restraint, the understanding that longevity was not liberation, but management. Doris Duke moved through the decades like a figure in slow motion. The world saw elegance refined by time. She felt the constancy of control embedded in every year. Age without softening became the quiet testament to a life constructed for endurance, admired for stability, and shadowed by the absence of ordinary imperfection. Legacy, Doris Duke came to understand, was not a certainty. It was a proposition. From earliest awareness, she had been told of the permanence surrounding her, the wealth accumulated over generations, the institutions built carefully, the cultural contributions recorded and preserved. Each spoke of continuity, as though her presence alone guaranteed endurance. Yet the deeper she looked, the more she recognized that permanence was an illusion, carefully maintained, easily questioned, and endlessly provisional. She realized that inheritance and influence carried an implicit conditionality. The fortune would survive her, the collections would remain curated, and the houses would continue to function as they always had. But the meaning of all of it, the legacy, depended entirely on perception. Trustees, advisors, curators, society at large, each carried a piece of interpretation, each preserved her narrative, each translated her life into a version suitable for scrutiny and admiration. Legacy was not hers to determine. It was to be performed. This created a quiet tension within her. Objects she collected, institutions she supported, philanthropic endeavors she directed, all were meaningful in context, but none bore the mark of individuality. They reflected taste, precision, and stewardship, yet they carried little trace of impulse, of passion, of the interior self. Doris began to sense that her own essence might not survive the translation into permanence. The legacy she inherited and maintained could be admired endlessly without ever revealing who she truly was. Society, for its part, was untroubled by ambiguity. They accepted the narrative she presented, the composed heiress, the cultured patron, the custodian of beauty and benevolence. Applause was steady, admiration polite, yet in their acceptance lay an erasure. Complexity, contradiction, and interiority were filtered out, leaving a figure legible and comforting. Legacy became a function of perception, not truth. This understanding reshaped her engagement with the world. Doris began to measure action not by desire, but by durability. Decisions were considered in terms of how they would be remembered, rather than how they would be felt. Friendships, projects, and artistic acquisitions were evaluated for endurance. Even affection was treated as a potential contribution to the narrative she would leave behind, rather than a spontaneous human connection. Yet the question mark persisted. She could manage, preserve, and direct, but she could not guarantee that the essence of her life, the interior experience, the unscripted impulses, the fleeting joys, would endure. She recognized that observers, trustees, and future generations would inevitably interpret, misinterpret, and simplify. What survived would be recognizable, yes, but only in outline. The subtle textures of her consciousness would remain invisible. This awareness introduced a quiet melancholy. Legacy, for Doris, was a mirror that reflected her presence without capturing herself. It promised continuity, yet left the core uncertain. The more she endeavored to secure permanence, the more she realized that true endurance was impossible, that history could only ever record surface, structure, and appearance. And so she continued. She maintained her fortune, her collections, her estates, her public generosity, all with care, all with precision, all with the knowledge that admiration did not equal understanding. The legacy she embodied would be studied, catalogued, celebrated, and curated, but it would always carry an invisible question. How much of Doris Duke, the woman, survived within Doris Duke, the institution? The question mark hovered like a shadow over every achievement, every acquisition, every measured gesture. Her life, magnificent and managed, remained, for all its splendor, fundamentally unresolved. By the time Doris Duke reached the years when youth might have softened her edges, the Gilded Age was no longer present in the streets or in the headlines. It lingered only in her estates, in her fortune, in the rituals that had shaped her from cradle to adulthood. She moved through a world that had declared itself modern, practical, and forward-looking, yet she carried with her the echoes of an era that refused to vanish entirely. The contrast was subtle but persistent. Society celebrated progress, reform, and efficiency. Yet her life continued to unfold in the measured cadence of the past. Houses were still designed to reassure rather than inspire. Objects were curated for permanence rather than whim, and advisors ensured that every step she took conformed to expectation. The Gilded Age had not ended so much as retreated, settling inside her life as quietly and absolutely as wealth itself. Doris understood this with clarity. She recognized that she embodied a world already vanished for everyone else. Etiquette, discretion, and restraint had become her default. Even her movements, travel, appearances, acquisition, echoed the rhythm of an age built for stability rather than spontaneity. She had been trained to preserve, not experiment, to endure, not disrupt. The world outside changed without inviting her along. New technologies, cultural shifts, and social revolutions did not alter her daily experience. She traveled as she had always traveled, collected as she had always collected, gave as she had always given. The framework surrounding her life absorbed change without needing to engage with it directly. Society evolved, yet her own orbit remained largely intact. This created a peculiar solitude. Doris inhabited spaces filled with history, beauty, and influence, yet she experienced them privately. She was present to others as a figure of admiration, but she existed for herself as an observer. The attention she received rarely touched her interior life. The public applauded a construction of presence rather than the being beneath it. She was the last vestige of a time when wealth could command respect simply by existing quietly and impeccably. Her awareness of this distinction deepened with age. She noted how observers assumed continuity, consistency, and composure while rarely considering the interior negotiation required to maintain them. Every gesture, every decision, every visible reaction had been honed, supervised, and mediated. To deviate, even slightly, was to risk exposure, a risk she had long learned to avoid. Yet the realization brought neither resentment nor regret. She understood that she had been shaped by forces both deliberate and invisible, and that to resist them would have been to court chaos. Instead, she moved through her life with the precision and elegance demanded by circumstance. The Gilded Age, fading outside her estates, persisted inside her own history, woven into the air she breathed, the walls she passed, the objects she touched. Doris Duke had become, in effect, a living relic. Her fortune, her name, her presence, all carried the weight of a bygone era. She was admired for continuity, celebrated for restraint, and understood by few. The world had moved forward, leaving her behind not by accident, but by design. She existed as the endpoint of a system that had shaped her from birth, and as its last witness, she carried both its grandeur and its isolation. And in this, she discovered a truth peculiar to the final heiress of her age. To survive the past intact is to live in the shadow of something already gone. The Gilded Age no longer demanded spectacle, it demanded preservation. Doris Duke fulfilled its requirement magnificently, silently, and alone. Memory, for Doris Duke, was not a spontaneous act of recollection. It was curated, disciplined, and often mediated before it reached her consciousness. The events of her life, both intimate and public, passed through a series of invisible filters long before they could settle as narrative. What remained was carefully edited, selective, polished, and at times profoundly incomplete. She remembered beginnings, but endings were often lost. Birthdays arrived marked with formality rather than emotion. Celebrations became exercises in procedure rather than delight. Tutors, advisors, and staff ensured that what she recalled would not disturb continuity, that reflection would remain calm, and that recollection never threatened the carefully maintained equilibrium of her world. In this way, memory functioned like her inheritance, present, influential, yet detached from her interior truth. Even private moments were touched by editing. Conversations with companions were constrained not only by social expectation, but by an invisible sense that some things should not be remembered in full. Words spoken, gestures made, feelings allowed, all were internalized, compressed, and filed in the mind as data points, rather than experiences. She might recall the laughter of a friend, yet the emotion that accompanied it was already tempered. She might remember a journey, yet the thrill of movement had been softened by expectation. Public events, too, were carefully rehearsed in memory before they were performed. Appearances at museums, fundraisers, and estates left impressions designed to satisfy both external observers and internal archives. Every interaction was catalogued, every reaction noted, and every misstep silently erased before it could disturb the narrative. Doris could remember what she was supposed to remember, but she rarely retained the spontaneity that defined human experience. The act of remembering itself became a form of discipline. Doris Duke learned to anticipate what should be retained, what could be acknowledged, and what should be gently discarded. She practiced this instinctively, shaping the contours of her own recollection as carefully as others shaped the trajectory of her life. To misremember was, in a sense, to misbehave. Memory required calibration, a quiet vigilance as exacting as any trustee's oversight. Over time, this discipline generated a curious duality. Memory preserved her identity, yet also erased the complexity of experience. She could reconstruct her life with precision, where she had been, what she had seen, the objects she had acquired, the appearances she had maintained. But the texture, the turbulence, the imperfections that might have humanized those recollections were absent. What remained was the distilled form of living, elegant and continuous, but quiet to the point of anesthesia. Doris understood increasingly that this editing was both gift and burden. It protected her from chaos, disappointment, and exposure, yet it also distanced her from herself. She remembered what she had been allowed to remember, not necessarily what she had felt. Emotional contours were flattened, spontaneity dampened, and the inner self became a private repository, partially inaccessible even to her own reflection. In the end, memory was another estate to inhabit. Each recollection was a carefully arranged room, furnished to reassure and controlled to prevent disruption. She could wander these spaces at will, yet she knew they were designed to guide her perception as much as to preserve it. The past, like the present, was mediated. Even her own mind had become a curated environment where what survived was always consistent with expectation. And so, Doris Duke carried the archive of her life carefully, elegantly, and alone, a succession of memories edited not only by others, but by the invisible hand of her upbringing, her wealth, and the unrelenting logic of an era determined to remain intact long after its time had passed. Doris Duke's fortune was unlike any ordinary accumulation of wealth. It had a life of its own, carefully restrained, carefully guided, and above all, carefully behaved. From the first dollar she inherited, it operated with precision, measured, predictable, and impervious to disruption. It did not shout, it did not flaunt, it did not demand attention. It simply existed, quietly, insistently, and with an orderliness that defined the rhythm of her life. This behavior was not accidental. It had been engineered over generations, industries built, estates acquired, investments diversified, all to ensure stability and continuity. The fortune had been trained to preserve itself, to anticipate risk, and to absorb consequence without faltering. Its power was absolute, but it concealed itself beneath layers of discretion and patience. It moved subtly through banks, boards, and legal instruments, imperceptible except to those who knew its design. Doris understood its authority from an early age. Money, she learned, is most potent when it is unnoticed. A fortune that declares itself too loudly invites scrutiny, envy, or mismanagement. The Duke wealth, by contrast, persisted unobtrusively, influencing decisions, shaping opportunity, and ensuring that her life remained insulated without ever announcing its presence. She learned to navigate around it, to act in accordance with it, without ever challenging it. The fortune had its own logic, a silent discipline that mirrored her upbringing. Spending was permitted, but always within expectation. Acquisition was encouraged, but only when it reinforced legacy rather than impulse. Philanthropy was celebrated, but it never distracted from the preservation of wealth itself. Every decision was filtered through the lens of continuity, measured against the invisible standard of what would ensure longevity. In this way, the fortune in Doris's life became intertwined. Her movements, choices, and even moods were subtly influenced by the mechanisms that governed her wealth. Trustees, advisors, and accountants operated as extensions of its will, translating its requirements into the forms she could understand. The system was not coercive, it was persuasive. It worked because she had been trained to see alignment as natural, compliance as instinct, and stability as virtue. Yet there was a tension inherent in such perfection. A fortune that behaves too well can constrain. It leaves little room for error, for spontaneity, or for deviation. Doris learned that to act freely was to risk disrupting not only perception, but the carefully maintained equilibrium that defined her existence. She became accustomed to measuring herself against invisible parameters, anticipating how even small impulses might ripple outward. Independence became a careful performance rather than a state of being. Even intimacy and attachment were shaped by this logic. Relationships, travels, and personal projects were conducted within boundaries set as much by the fortune as by etiquette. The wealth's invisible presence mediated experience, ensuring that her life remained orderly, contained, and untouchable. It protected her, yes, but it also shaped her, guiding her into a life of preservation rather than adventure. In essence, the Duke fortune had learned to govern its heir as much as she had learned to navigate it. Together, they moved through decades in perfect synchrony. Wealth disciplined, Heiress composed, both silent, both constant, both enduring. And in the quiet precision of this partnership, Doris Duke understood a singular truth: the fortune had become more than money. It was an institution, a custodian, and ultimately a force that ensured her life, like itself, would remain impeccably intact, admired, and untouched by the chaos of ordinary existence. Silence, Doris Duke discovered, was more enduring than wealth. It had begun in her childhood, filtered through rooms that observed without comment, through guardians who intervened gently, and through a fortune that managed consequence before it could arrive. Over time, the quiet accumulated, layering itself into her perception, her presence, and the rhythm of her life. By adulthood, silence had become a companion, subtle yet insistent, shaping her thoughts and actions without the need for instruction. It moved with her. Even as she traveled from estate to estate, from city to city, the quiet accompanied her. Rooms were prepared, staff were informed, and routines were established in advance. The world outside her doors continued its turbulence, but within, stillness reigned. It was not absence, it was control, a soft, pervasive authority that required no enforcement. Silence was not merely the lack of sound, it was the management of consequence, the mitigation of risk, the preservation of order. Doris internalized it effortlessly. She learned to moderate her voice, to regulate her gestures, to temper her presence. Impulse became measured. Desire was softened before expression. Even thought was disciplined, filtered through expectation and precedent. To deviate from the quiet was to disrupt not just perception, but the carefully maintained harmony that defined her life. Silence, once external, had become internalized, and then it passed forward. In interactions with friends, staff, and associates, Doris extended the same discipline she had absorbed. She did not enforce silence, but she modeled it, creating an atmosphere in which discretion, patience, and measured response were normative. Observers adjusted their own behavior, learning to speak carefully, act deliberately, and respect boundaries unspoken. The quiet spread naturally, like mist-filling corridors at dawn, shaping reality without visible hand or command. Philanthropy, art, and society became conduits for this transmission. Generosity was offered quietly, without fanfare, yet carefully documented. Collections were acquired and displayed with precision, admired without interruption. Public appearances conveyed composure and refinement, never exuberance. In every arena, silence was both medium and message, guiding interaction and expectation with subtlety. Those who engaged with her life learned to mirror its cadence, adopting restraint as instinct. Yet silence was never neutral. It shaped Doris as much as it shaped those around her. The world adapted to her composure, not to her whims. Relationships became filtered, dialogue measured, intimacy constrained. Observers seldom penetrated the layers of quiet. They responded to form rather than content, reacting to the cadence of restraint rather than the impulses beneath it. In this way, silence protected, but it also isolated. It became both shield and boundary, guardian and barrier. Doris recognized its paradox. The quiet had been a gift, safety, discretion, dignity, yet it demanded constant participation. One could not live fully within its presence without internalizing its rules. Independence was measured, expression moderated, thought constrained. The world admired her for it, yet never truly entered it. Silence passed forward, perpetuated the very containment that had shaped her. And so she moved through life with careful steps. Her days were punctuated by sound only where necessary, her words measured, her gestures moderated. The quiet enveloped her, steady and deliberate, extending beyond her presence to those she allowed near. Doris Duke carried it forward with precision, a living legacy of stillness, endurance, and invisible authority, a silence that protected, preserved, and ultimately defined the life of America's last Gilded Age heiress. The world beyond Doris Duke's estates did not wait. It continued to evolve, to shift, to redefine itself without pause for nostalgia or precedent. Streets transformed, industries rose and fell, and social norms advanced in ways both visible and subtle. The newspapers chronicled progress, public life accelerated, cities expanded, fashions changed, and new technologies demanded attention. Yet Doris's world, the one she had inherited, the one she had mastered, moved more slowly, as though insulated from the rush of history. She noticed it early, as a subtle dissonance between her environment and the outer world. Automobiles replaced carriages. Airlines crossed continents in hours. Communications carried news instantaneously. Yet within her homes, her routines, her collections, and her staff, life retained the cadence of an earlier century. Interiors, appointments, and gestures were unchanged by external upheaval. Time here moved in carefully measured increments, calculated for preservation rather than spontaneity. The contrast was both stark and invisible. Visitors, advisors, and occasional journalists saw Doris moving through her life with elegance and composure. They noted her taste, her generosity, her intelligence. They praised her refinement, yet they failed to perceive the subtle tension beneath the polish. The world outside had grown impatient while the world inside had remained frozen. She was, in effect, a custodian of a time that no longer existed, a living bridge between an age that had receded and one that surged forward without pause. Even her wealth reflected this duality. Investments, trusts, and holdings moved with careful attention, adapting just enough to preserve growth without threatening the rhythm of continuity. Corporations evolved, markets shifted, new technologies emerged, yet the fortune surrounding her operated as though insulated from volatility. It yielded influence, maintained relevance, and permitted participation in public life, all while maintaining the careful stillness that had defined her experience from birth. This insulated life both protected and constrained her. She could observe the changes around her without being drawn into them. She could travel, contribute, and interact without the demands of recklessness or error. Yet she was also increasingly aware of the distance between herself and the broader currents of society. Conversations with peers often skirted immediacy. Involvement in innovation was selective and measured. Her influence was enduring, but her engagement was deliberate, filtered, and at times provisional. Even as society celebrated transformation, Doris maintained continuity. She moved with grace, attended galas, patronized the arts, and extended her fortune in acts of philanthropy. Each action was deliberate, consistent with precedent, and carefully managed to preserve reputation and authority. Yet every decision reinforced the separation between the world that surged forward and the world she inhabited, one directed, composed, insulated. And she observed quietly. From her vantage, she saw change without needing to participate fully, evolution without needing to bend. The contrast between progress and preservation shaped her understanding of her own role. She was a steward not merely of wealth or beauty, but of history itself. Her life was both contemporary and archaic, a witness to what had been and what continued, untouchable and immovable amidst the currents of a nation racing forward. Doris Duke moved among it all with composure, elegance, and discretion. The world advanced, yet she remained a fixed point, admired, relevant, and profoundly apart. She had inherited the past, and the present learned to move around her. Doris Duke's life was observed, catalogued, and interpreted long before she could shape it herself. By the time she matured into the heiress, the world admired. Her existence had already been partially written, arranged, and sanctioned. Every gesture, every acquisition, every public appearance was anticipated in advance, and understood according to a framework that had little to do with her interior reality. In this way, her life was, from the outset, designed to be misunderstood. Those who interacted with her rarely saw the full scope of intention behind her decisions. Advisors, staff, and trustees viewed her presence as a series of predictable outputs: measured generosity, elegant composure, prudent action. Society at large received these manifestations as natural extensions of her inheritance, the perfectly behaved heiress, guided by instinct and grace. Yet the truth was subtler. The appearances were meticulously maintained. The spontaneity she might have exercised had been softened into habit. Her life was a performance, not in theater, but in reality itself. Even private relationships were framed within this architecture. Companions, friends, and advisors encountered the version of Doris shaped to preserve continuity rather than intimacy. Emotional cues were calibrated, reactions moderated, and desires filtered through expectation. It was impossible to know which behaviors were genuine and which were learned, and perhaps even she was unsure. Silence became a tool, as effective as any spoken word, controlling perception while concealing complexity. Philanthropy, travel, and art were similarly codified. Each action had precedent, each acquisition had justification, each donation carried a rationale aligned with reputation. What might have been impulsive or passionate was softened into deliberate consequence. Generosity became a statement of expectation rather than of personal instinct. Movement through the world, across continents and institutions, followed a script that had been prepared by the weight of wealth and the oversight of advisors. In this way, her life was readable, but only at a distance, an elegant outline missing its interior detail. The misunderstanding was inevitable. It was designed. Observers admired her decisiveness without considering the mediation behind it. They respected her judgment without seeing the constraints within which she operated. They envied her freedom without recognizing its invisible limits. The world was compelled to interpret her as autonomous because overt management had been rendered invisible. The very skill that kept her life intact, compliance, anticipation, moderation, ensured that truth remained inaccessible. Doris herself was aware of this, though she seldom spoke of it. She understood that privacy, discretion, and control, though protective, carried the subtle cost of isolation. Her decisions were her own in appearance, yet filtered through a lifetime of preparation and expectation. The interpretation of her life belonged to others, and the legacy of misunderstanding was guaranteed. This, she recognized, was the final inheritance of the Gilded Age, to live magnificently, publicly admired, yet fundamentally unreadable. Every movement reinforced the narrative curated for her, every achievement echoed expectation, every display of composure deepened the separation between appearance and interior life. She existed as a figure of precision, elegance, and authority, a life meticulously constructed to ensure admiration, and in doing so, to ensure that it could never be fully known. Doris Duke moved through her years with grace and awareness, bearing the quiet burden of a life designed for observation rather than understanding. In a world that applauded her every step, she carried the invisible truth of her own experience. To be perfect, controlled, and untouchable is to be perpetually misunderstood. Lavishness, Doris Duke discovered, does not announce its decline. It fades imperceptibly, leaving behind traces that suggest continuity, while silently altering everything beneath the surface. The estates, the collections, the parties, the appearances, all remained impeccable. Guests admired elegance, journalists noted composure, and society continued to celebrate abundance. Yet, behind the surface, the intensity of accumulation had softened. Wealth, influence, and extravagance persisted, but their edges dulled with the passage of time, leaving a subtler, quieter kind of opulence. The houses remained magnificent. Rooms were polished, carpets stretched, curtains drawn with precision. Artifacts stood as they always had, their provenance recorded, their positions carefully maintained. Staff continued to move invisibly through the estates, anticipating her needs, preserving her presence, and minimizing disruption. From a distance, nothing appeared to have changed, and yet the very weight of upkeep, the cost, the management, the effort required to sustain perfection began to shift the meaning of lavishness itself. Doris felt it most in the rhythm of her days. Travel, once a thrilling extension of autonomy and curiosity, became more predictable, more scheduled, more deliberate. Journeys across continents offered fewer surprises. Curated events replaced spontaneous opportunity. Even the acquisitions she pursued, while extraordinary in value, began to feel preordained rather than inspired. Luxury had become a language of preservation, not exhilaration. The public still admired her. The world applauded. Newspapers chronicled her taste and generosity. Yet admiration, when constant, ceases to challenge perception. The spectacle of wealth persisted, but it no longer carried the same energy. Its capacity to astonish, to inspire awe, to provoke conversation had diminished in proportion to its predictability. The edges of extravagance, once sharp and dazzling, had softened into formality. Privately, Doris understood the paradox: to be constantly observed, to be meticulously managed, to have every desire anticipated, was to preserve life from turbulence, and in doing so, to temper its vitality. The lavishness she embodied had lost some of its spontaneity, its risk, its pulse. Luxury remained, but it moved more slowly, less insistently, less threateningly. It provided comfort, stability, and reassurance, but it no longer demanded attention in the way it had during the early years of her inheritance. This quiet fading extended beyond property and possession. Relationships, too, reflected the principle. Companions were admired for discretion. Intimacy was managed. Alliances were maintained with elegance rather than passion. Even affection, carefully cultivated over decades, followed expectation more closely than impulse. Lavishness of spirit, like lavishness of fortune, had become muted, disciplined, and carefully measured. Yet Doris bore no resentment for this. She understood that it was the natural consequence of the life she had inherited, of wealth, legacy, and oversight extended over a lifetime. The fading of extravagance was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the quiet dignity of endurance. In its restraint, she found a different kind of splendor, one that demanded awareness, patience, and grace to fully appreciate. As the years advanced, Doris moved through her world with the calm authority of one who understood that true opulence need not shout. Lavishness no longer dazzled, but it endured, refined and tempered by time. It had become a testament not to impulse or audacity, but to continuity, a quiet, persistent reminder that a life managed, preserved, and observed could remain magnificent, even as its brilliance softened imperceptibly around the edges. Doris Duke's life, when viewed in its entirety, resembled a vast, meticulously arranged estate, magnificent, orderly, and wholly contained. Every gesture, every acquisition, every journey had been anticipated, measured, and managed long before it reached her hands. Yet in the quiet moments she understood that the wealth, the power, and the privileges that defined her existence had never been hers to master. They had been conferred, administered, and preserved for her, leaving little room for deviation. She was the final unbroken witness to an era that had passed and to a fortune that had always dictated the terms of her freedom. Escape was never offered. From childhood, the pattern had been established. Advisors, trustees, and staff orchestrated each detail of her upbringing, ensuring that her impulses were absorbed into predictability. Movement, expression, and even desire were monitored and managed with subtlety so precise that it became indistinguishable from instinct. Even rebellion, when it appeared, was softened, redirected, or absorbed into the broader narrative of compliance. She learned early that independence was a performance and freedom a calculated risk. Her estates, her collections, and her appearances were both prison and stage. The houses were pristine, staffed by caretakers who anticipated need without being intrusive. Rooms were arranged for comfort and efficiency, yet their perfection reinforced discipline. Artifacts and treasures surrounded her, offering beauty without demand, yet subtly conditioning the mind to maintain equilibrium. Even the applause of society arrived, mediated, structured, and distant, echoing the life she was expected to perform rather than the self she might have chosen. Everything conspired to keep her intact, elegant, admired, and fundamentally contained. The paradox of her existence became more evident with time. She was admired, studied, envied, and celebrated, yet her interior life remained largely inaccessible. Observers interpreted her comportment as evidence of autonomy, yet it was produced through centuries of inherited expectation, cultivated discipline, and careful oversight. The very qualities that inspired awe were born of limitation. She was both present and absent, fully visible in public, yet untouchable in essence. Even her wealth, the very instrument that might have offered liberation, reinforced her containment. The fortune had learned to behave with the same precision that had defined her upbringing. It anticipated crises, absorbed consequence, and ensured continuity. It could sustain independence in theory, yet it demanded conformity in practice. To wield it fully required understanding that was never necessary, or permitted, in her life. Every asset, every estate, every collection reinforced the structures that preserved her status while circumscribing her agency. By the end, Doris understood the unyielding truth. She had been perfected for preservation. Her movements, her decisions, and even her desires were guided by forces she had internalized so completely that they felt like instinct. She had mastered the art of appearing free, unburdened, and untouchable, and yet every choice remained subtly directed by the structures that had shaped her since birth. She had survived, endured, and flourished, but she had never escaped the system into which she had been born. And in this, there was a kind of solemn majesty. To live impeccably, to endure without scandal, to preserve a fortune, a legacy, and an image while the world changed around her, required skill and discipline few could comprehend. Doris Duke, America's last Gilded Age heiress, became not only a figure of wealth and refinement, but a living monument to the power of preservation. She never escaped, and perhaps that was the point. Her life, like the era she represented, was meant to endure beyond impulse, beyond passion, and beyond the ordinary reach of human experience. She remained untouchable, complete, and magnificently alone, the final embodiment of a world that had once dazzled and which she carried quietly into eternity.